Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, tonight we begin a journey into the hidden hours of 18th century European women. Picture this. While their husbands conducted business in coffee houses and gentlemen's clubs, women retreated behind closed doors to afternoons that society barely understood. What really happened during those quiet hours? The truth might surprise you. These weren't just moments of idleness or simple tea drinking. No, these afternoons held secrets, passions, rebellions, and a world of creativity that history almost forgot. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the most intimate, the most revealing, and perhaps the most powerful hours in a woman's day during the 1700s. What you're about to discover will change how you see everything from your afternoon tea to the very concept of women's freedom. Now, before we step into this forgotten world together, I need to ask you something. If you're curious about the untold stories of history, the kind textbooks skip over, then please subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button if you appreciate deep dives into the past. And share this video with anyone who loves discovering the truth behind the pretty paintings and polite manners of history. And I'm genuinely curious, where are you watching from right now? Are you in bed getting ready to drift off? Or maybe you're winding down after a long day? Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're in. I love hearing from you. Now, get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe turn on a soft fan for some gentle background sound, and let's travel back in time together to discover what really happened when the drawing room doors closed. So let's start with something that might seem strange to us today. In 18th century Europe, particularly in England during what we call the Georgian and Regency periods, the concept of time itself worked differently for women. When we say afternoon, we think of the hours between noon and evening, maybe 3 to 6. But for women in the 1700s, morning could stretch all the way until dinner time, which might not happen until 8 or 9 in the evening.
Yes, you heard that right.
If a woman wrote in her diary that she spent a pleasant morning visiting friends, she might actually be talking about what we would call 2 or 3 in the afternoon. This wasn't just a quirk of language. It reflected something deeper about how women's lives were structured. The day was divided into 2 parts, morning and evening. Morning was everything before dinner. Evening was everything after. And the dividing line, the moment when women changed their dresses. That's right. The entire structure of a woman's day pivoted on the ritual of changing clothes. This tells us something fascinating. Appearances weren't just important. They were the framework that held the entire day together. Let me paint you a more specific picture. Imagine you're a woman in 1740 London. You wake before sunrise. Perhaps around 6 in the morning. The servants have already been awake for hours building fires, heating water, preparing the house. But you, as a lady of some means, have a few precious moments that belong only to you. Elizabeth Robinson, who later became the famous Elizabeth Montagu and founded the Blue Stocking Society, often wrote about these early hours. She would practice piano before breakfast, or take a quiet walk in her garden, or write letters to her friends. These moments before breakfast were hers alone. Breakfast itself happened around 10 in the morning in most households, though country families might eat earlier. Can you imagine 10 o'clock breakfast? Your entire morning gone before you've even eaten. But remember, you've already been awake for 4 hours by then. You've already lived half a day in those quiet pre-dawn hours. And here's where it gets really interesting. What came after breakfast? Those hours we would call mid-morning and afternoon. Those were the hours. That defined a woman's existence. Because while men could leave the house, conduct business, visit their clubs, attend coffee houses where ideas and politics and philosophy were discussed freely, women had to create their entire world within the walls of their homes, or if they were lucky, in the carefully controlled spaces that society deemed appropriate for them. Now, let's talk about class for a moment, because not all women experience these afternoons the same way. If you were an aristocratic woman, the wife or daughter of a lord, your afternoons might be filled with social calls, needlework, music practice, and managing servants. You had leisure time, but it came with strict rules about how to use it. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted. Everything had to reflect well on your family's status. If you were a middle-class woman, perhaps the wife of a merchant or a professional man, your afternoons were a delicate balance. You had some servants, but not many. You might spend your afternoon doing fine needlework to show you had the time for such refinements. But you also had to manage your household accounts, supervise the kitchen, ensure everything ran smoothly. Your afternoons were about proving you belonged to the respectable classes. And if you were a working-class woman, well, the concept of a quiet afternoon was almost laughable. Your afternoon was spent in labor, whether that was sewing shirts for pennies, working in a shop, helping in the dairy, or any of 100 other tasks that kept body and soul together. The quiet afternoons we're exploring tonight were in many ways a privilege that came with economic security. But let's focus on those women who did have these afternoon hours, because what they did with that time is absolutely fascinating. They created entire worlds. They built networks that would eventually change society. They developed skills and passions that the official history books barely mention. Consider this. In the 1700s of Europe, women couldn't vote. They couldn't own property once they married. Everything became their husbands. They couldn't attend university. They were legally considered, in the words of the law, covered by their husbands' identities. A married woman had no separate legal existence. She was quite literally the property of her husband. So, how did women survive this? How did they maintain their sense of self, their creativity, their intelligence, their very personhood in a world that said they were legally invisible? The answer lies in those afternoon hours. Behind the closed doors of drawing rooms and private chambers, women created spaces where they could be fully human. Let me share a story that captures this perfectly. In 1741, there was a smallpox outbreak in England. Elizabeth Robinson's sister fell ill, and to protect herself, Elizabeth was sent to stay at the house of one of her father's tenants, Mr. Smith. Now, this might sound like a simple medical precaution, but for Elizabeth, it was kind of imprisonment. She was isolated from her family, from her friends, from everything familiar, and she was terrified. What did she do with her lonely afternoons? She filled them with books. She read Plutarch's Lives, those moralistic biographies of ancient Greek and Roman heroes. She read the letters between the Roman philosopher Cicero and his friend Atticus. And she wrote to her own friends about what she was reading. In one letter to Anne Donnellan, she wrote, "I am forced to go back to former ages for my companions. Cicero and Plutarch's heroes are my only company." Think about that for a moment. Here was a young woman isolated during a plague, and she created community through books and letters. She wasn't just reading to pass time. She was building intellectual friendships across distance, across time, even reaching back to ancient Rome to find companions who understood the life of the mind. And she and Anne were doing something else remarkable. They were reading the same book at the same time and writing to each other about it. Does this sound familiar? It's basically an 18th century book club conducted through the mail. They were creating shared experiences through literature, using letters to discuss ideas, to challenge each other's thinking, to grow intellectually together. This pattern of shared reading and discussion through letters became the foundation for what Elizabeth would later help create, the Blue Stocking Circle. This was a group of intellectual women who met regularly to discuss literature, philosophy, and ideas. They invited men to their gatherings too, but on equal terms. No flirting, no games, just serious conversation. It was revolutionary, and it started from those lonely afternoons of reading and writing letters. But here's what I find most moving about this story. Elizabeth Robinson was following the rules of her society. She was staying home like a good woman should. She was occupying herself with quiet indoor activities. The outside it looked perfectly proper, but inside in her mind, in those letters, in those afternoon hours of reading, she was free. She was traveling to ancient Rome, debating with Cicero, learning from Plutarch. Her body might have been confined, but her mind knew no boundaries. This is the secret of those 18th century afternoons. On the surface they looked like nothing: tea drinking, needlework, letter writing, music practice, simple domestic feminine activities. But underneath, these afternoons were where women built the foundations of change. Every letter shared between intellectual friends, every book read and discussed, every idea explored in the privacy of a drawing room was a tiny act of resistance against a world that said women didn't need minds of their own. And here's something that might surprise you. The very structure of the day, that division between morning and evening marked by the changing of clothes, gave women something precious. It gave them legitimate reasons to be in private spaces. When a woman retired to her chamber to change her dress, she had perhaps 30 minutes or an hour when she could be alone, or alone with just her maid. In a world where privacy was almost non-existent, where even letters might be read aloud as entertainment, these moments of changing clothes were some of the only truly private moments a woman might have. Some women used these moments to write in secret diaries. Others used them to read forbidden books. Some just used them to think, to be alone with their thoughts, to remember who they were underneath all the social expectations. The afternoon hours were also when most social visiting happened, and this was crucial for women because visits were how they maintained their networks, how they shared information, how they supported each other. Remember, there were no telephones, no text messages, no email. If you wanted to stay connected with your friends, you had to either write letters or make visits. And visits had to happen during appropriate hours, which meant afternoon. These social calls followed strict rules, but within those rules women could accomplish a great deal. A visit was supposed to last at least 30 minutes, but no more than an hour or two. You would arrive, be shown into the drawing room, exchange news and gossip, perhaps take tea, and then depart. But in those visits, women shared everything from recipes to political opinions, from advice on child-rearing to recommendations for books. They created a whole network of information exchange that existed completely outside the male-dominated spaces of coffee houses and clubs. And let me tell you, that information network was powerful. When you couldn't participate in official politics, when you couldn't vote or hold office, information became your currency. Knowing who was marrying whom, which families were in financial trouble, what the latest fashion from Paris looked like, who said what at last night's dinner party. This was power. This was how women influenced their world. But we need to be honest about something too. Not all of these afternoon hours were empowering or creative. Some women spent their afternoons in crushing boredom. Lady Bertram in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park spends her days sitting nicely dressed on a sofa, doing some long piece of needlework of little use and mo beauty. That's a devastating description, isn't it? Just sitting there dressed up, doing work that accomplishes nothing, that isn't even beautiful, day after day after day. Some women experience their afternoons as a kind of prison. The same rooms, the same activities, the same limited conversation over and over. No wonder some of them turned to laudanum or other tonics to make the hours pass more bearably. No wonder some of them felt what the Duchess of Bedford would later describe as a sinking feeling between lunch and dinner. This is the paradox of those 18th century afternoons. For some women they were hours of freedom, creativity, and intellectual growth. For others, they were endless expanses of tedious time that had to be somehow filled. And for most women, they were probably both. Some days full of purpose and pleasure, other days hollow and haunting. What determined the difference? Often it came down to money and education. If you had money, you could afford books, musical instruments, art supplies. You could host tea parties and salons. You could travel to tea gardens or attend concerts. Money bought you options for how to spend your time. And if you had education, you had the tools to make use of those options. You could read challenging books, compose music, engage in sophisticated conversation. But even without money or education, women found ways to make their afternoons meaningful. Working-class women created their own communities, their own networks. The quilting bee, where women would gather to work together on a quilt, was a treasured social event. The work had to be finished. The husbands came home for dinner, so there was a pleasant urgency to it. And while they worked, they talked, they shared stories, they supported each other through life's challenges. These gatherings were second only to church services in their social importance. That tells you something about how crucial they were. In a world where women's lives could be very isolated, these afternoon gatherings were lifelines. So, as we close this first part of our journey, I want you to think about this. Those quiet afternoons in 18th century Europe were never really quiet. Behind the closed doors, beneath the surface of propriety, women were reading, thinking, creating, connecting, surviving, and slowly, gradually building the networks and developing the skills that would eventually change their world. In our next part, we're going to dive deep into one of the most fascinating afternoon rituals, the tea ceremony. But this isn't what you think. We're not just talking about drinking tea. We're talking about a beverage that was once more expensive than gold, about ceremonies that gave women rare moments of power, about scandals and secrets shared over delicate china cups, and about how a simple drink from China helped create the first public spaces where women could meet men on equal terms. Trust me, the story of tea in 18th century Europe is stranger and more revealing than you could imagine. So stay with me and let's continue this journey together. Imagine holding in your hand something worth more than its weight in gold, something so precious that it's kept locked away in a special box and only you hold the key, something that declares your status, your wealth, your very importance in society. Now imagine that this treasure is just dried leaves. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? But in 18th century Europe, tea was exactly that precious, exactly that powerful. And the afternoon tea ceremony gave women something they had almost nowhere else: control. Let's go back to where it all started. The year is 1662. A Portuguese princess named Catherine of Braganza is about to marry King Charles II of England. Among her dowry, among all the gold and territories and political alliances, she brings something that will change English culture forever: a casket filled with tea. Now, Catherine had grown up drinking tea in Portugal, where it was already the preferred beverage of the wealthy. But in England, most people had never even heard of it. Picture the English court seeing this strange drink for the first time: dark leaves steeped in hot water, producing a bitter brown liquid. It must have seemed so exotic, so foreign. But Catherine loved her tea, and as queen, what she loved, the court had to at least pretend to love too. She invited her ladies to join her in her private chambers for tea. And here's something that might shock you. In the 18th century, it was perfectly normal for high-born ladies to receive callers while still in bed, drinking their morning. Yes, you heard that right. Important social visits could happen while the hostess was lounging in bed in her nightclothes sipping tea. Can you imagine doing that today? Inviting your friends over while you're still in your pajamas in bed? But this wasn't seen as improper. It was actually a sign of intimacy and trust. If a lady invited you to her morning tea in her bedchamber, it meant you were part of her inner circle. But let's talk about why tea was so incredibly expensive. Between 1640 and 1822, the average person in England spent 9% of their earnings on tea. 9%. That's a huge portion of someone's income. To put that in perspective, imagine spending 9% of your salary on just one beverage. For most people today, that would be hundreds of dollars every month, just for tea. Why so expensive? Well, tea had to travel halfway across the globe. It took between 12 and 15 months for ships to bring tea from China to Britain. 12 to 15 months. At sea, through storms and pirates and all kinds of dangers. And when it finally arrived, the British government slapped a 119% import tax on it. Yes, 119%. The tax was more than the cost of the tea itself. This created something fascinating, a massive black market for tea. Smugglers would bring in tea illegally, avoiding the tax. It became so common that some historians estimate more tea was smuggled into Britain than imported legally. There were entire criminal networks built around tea smuggling. People risked their lives, went to prison, all for those dried leaves. But here's what I find most interesting. Despite this astronomical cost, tea became a national obsession. By the 18th century, even people who could barely afford it were drinking tea. They were choosing to spend their limited money on this luxury item. Why? What was so special about tea that people were willing to pay such prices for it? Part of it was medicinal. Believed tea had healing properties. It was supposed to be good for your health, unlike gin, which was the other cheap drink available and which was destroying communities. The government actually encouraged people to switch from gin to tea, even though tea was more expensive. At least tea didn't leave you drunk and incapable. But more than that, tea created social opportunities. And for women especially, tea opened doors that had been firmly closed. You see, in the 18th century, coffee houses were everywhere in cities like London, and coffee houses were where everything important happened. Politics was discussed there. Business deals were made there. Philosophy was debated there. Writers met there. Scientists shared their discoveries there. Coffee houses were called penny universities, because for the price of a penny and a cup of coffee you could sit and listen to some of the greatest minds of the age. But women were absolutely forbidden from entering coffee houses. These were male spaces, and women who tried to enter would be turned away or worse, assumed to be prostitutes. So women were shut out from all those conversations, all that intellectual exchange, all that social networking that was happening over coffee. Tea changed that, because tea was associated with women from the start, thanks to Queen Catherine. And because tea was consumed at home initially, it was respectable for women. But then in the early 18th century, something magical happened. Tea gardens opened. Tea gardens were outdoor spaces where people could stroll, listen to music, see entertainments, and yes, drink tea. And unlike coffee houses, tea gardens welcomed both men and women. For the first time, there were public spaces where women could meet men on relatively equal terms, where they could participate in social life outside the home without being seen as improper. Places like Vauxhall Gardens and Ranelagh Gardens in London became hugely popular. People would dress in their finest clothes and spend entire afternoons and evenings there. There were concerts, fireworks, acrobats, all kinds of entertainment. Mozart performed at tea gardens. So did Handel. These weren't lowbrow venues. They were where culture happened, and women could go there. They could meet friends there, both male and female. They could be seen, could see and be seen. After being shut out of coffee houses, tea gardens gave women a public presence they'd been denied. But let's get back to the afternoon tea ceremony at home, because this is where women wielded real power. In wealthy homes, tea was kept in a locked tea caddy or tea chest, and the lady of the house kept the key. Not the servants, not her husband, but her. She alone controlled access to this precious commodity. When guests arrived for afternoon tea, the lady of the house would unlock her tea caddy in full view of everyone. This wasn't just practical, it was theatre. She was demonstrating her wealth, her status, her power. She would then blend her own teas, mixing different varieties to create her own custom blend. This was considered a refined skill, and women took pride in their tea blending abilities. Think about what this meant. In a world where women controlled very little, where they couldn't own property, couldn't make legal decisions, couldn't even control their own money once they married, the tea ceremony gave them a realm of authority. In that drawing room with that locked box and that key, the woman was in charge, and the equipment for tea drinking was itself a status symbol. The finest porcelain from China was incredibly expensive and incredibly fragile. In the 18th century, if you owned a porcelain teacup, you might have your portrait painted holding it. People were so proud of their teacups that they would bring their own to parties, carried in special padded cases. Imagine that, bringing your own cup to a tea party because you didn't want to risk someone else's cup or because you wanted to show off your own. Beautiful cup. Here's another detail that fascinates me. Early teacups didn't have handles. They were bowls, drunk Chinese style. You would pour the hot tea into the saucer to let it cool, then drink it from the saucer. This wasn't considered rude, it was normal. Handles on teacups didn't become standard until about 100 years later, and after a tea party, the hostess herself would wash the cups and saucers, not the servants. The lady of the house would have 2 bowls of water brought to the drawing room, one soapy, one for rinsing, along with a fine linen cloth, and she would personally wash each precious cup. This practice came directly from 17th and 18th century England, where these cups were too valuable to trust to anyone else. But tea wasn't just about showing off expensive china. It became a ritual that structured women's social lives. There were different types of tea gatherings. There was the intimate tea for close friends, where serious conversation could happen. There was the larger at-home day, where a woman would receive callers on a specific day each week. There were the kettle drums, which were large, informal afternoon parties where guests could come and go as they pleased. Kettle drums are particularly interesting. The name might have come from the tea kettles used, or it might have been a combination of kettle and drum, which was 18th century slang for a lively party. At kettle drums, guests didn't have to stay for a set period. They could drop in for 20 minutes or stay for 2 hours. They could mingle freely. No formal seating arrangements. This was much more relaxed than a formal tea. And here's where tea parties got really interesting. They became places where scandal and gossip flowed as freely as the tea itself. There's a wonderful quote from the 18th century author Henry Fielding. "Love and scandal are the best sweeteners of tea." Think about that. The real sweetness of tea wasn't sugar. It was the intimate conversation. Secrets shared, the gossip exchanged. This is why servants were traditionally kept out of the drawing room during tea. It wasn't just about privacy, it was about freedom. When the servants weren't there, women could talk more openly. They could share information they didn't want spreading to other households through the servant network. They could discuss politics, religion, personal matters, anything they wanted. Tea parties became places where women could speak their minds, at least to each other, where they could share opinions that would be considered inappropriate if spoken in mixed company, where they could support each other, advise each other, comfort each other. And sometimes tea parties became places of real intellectual exchange. The famous Blue Stocking Society that Elizabeth Montagu helped found often met for tea. But these weren't typical tea parties. The Blue Stockings invited both men and women, but they had a strict rule. No flirting, no card games, just conversation. About literature, philosophy, science, and ideas. They were using the respectable framework of a tea party to create something revolutionary, a space where women's minds were taken as seriously as men's. Not everyone approved, of course. The blue stockings were often mocked. The name itself, blue stocking, started as an insult, referring to a man who wore blue worsted stockings instead of fancy black silk ones to one of their gatherings. The name stuck, and it was meant to suggest that these women were unfashionable, dowdy, too intellectual, not properly feminine. But the blue stockings didn't care. They kept meeting, kept discussing ideas, kept proving that women could engage with serious intellectual topics. And they did it all over tea, using the one social ritual that was unquestionably acceptable for women. Now, let me share something that shows just how seriously people took tea. In 1773, the British East India Company tried to force tea onto the American colonies. They sent 3 ships full of tea to Boston, and you probably know what happened next. The Boston Tea Party, American colonists angry about taxation without representation threw all that tea into Boston Harbor. But here's what's less well known. American women played a crucial role in the boycott of British tea that followed. They organized. They pledged to stop drinking tea. They held spinning bees to make their own cloth instead of buying British fabric. They turned their tea parties into political gatherings. The Edmonton Tea Party of 1774 was a group of women in North Carolina who publicly signed a petition supporting the boycott of British goods. This was radical. Women weren't supposed to be involved in politics, but they were using their domestic sphere, their control over household purchasing, their tea-drinking rituals, as political tools. The afternoon tea, that supposedly frivolous feminine activity, became a site of revolution. Back in England, tea continued its reign. Queen Anne, who ruled in the early 18th century, loved tea so much that she replaced the tiny Chinese teapots with the large, bell-shaped silver teapot that could hold much more. This became the style. Teapots got bigger, tea sets got more elaborate, and as the century progressed, afternoon tea evolved. It wasn't until the 1830s and 1840s that afternoon tea, as we know it today, really developed. The Duchess of Bedford is credited with this. She started experiencing that sinking feeling between lunch and dinner, which by then was being served later and later in the evening. So she began asking for tea and light snacks to be brought to her room in the afternoon. She shared this habit with Queen Victoria, and it caught on. Suddenly, everyone was having afternoon tea with sandwiches and cakes. It became a full meal, not just a drink, and it remained primarily a women's ritual. Men might be invited occasionally, but afternoon tea was women's time. What I love about this is how women took something that started as just a beverage and transformed it into a complex social ritual that gave them power, gave them community, gave them a public presence they were denied in other areas. They took tea and made it theirs. And in doing so, they created networks that would eventually help change society. The friendships formed over tea, the ideas discussed over teacups, the support systems built during afternoon tea parties, these all contributed to the gradual shift toward women's education, women's rights, women's public participation in society. So the next time you make yourself a cup of tea, think about those 18th century women. Think about Catherine of Braganza introducing tea to England. Think about the women who spent 9% of their income on those precious leaves. Think about the ladies who held the keys to their tea caddies like they held the keys to small kingdoms. Think about the conversations that happened, the secrets that were shared, the ideas that were born, all over cups. Tea was never just a drink. It was ceremony. It was power. It was community. It was rebellion, all wrapped up in those fragile porcelain cups without handles. And now, speaking of things that were far more than they appeared to be, we need to talk about another afternoon activity that looked simple on the surface, but held depths of meaning underneath. We need to talk about needlework, about the needle and thread that could be tools of both oppression and liberation. Because what women did with their needles in those quiet afternoon hours tells us everything about creativity, resistance, and the prison that beautiful things can sometimes be. So let's keep going. Let's discover together what happened when women picked up their needles and began to stitch. There's a letter that breaks my heart every time I think about it. It's from 1770, written by Marie Antoinette, the young Dauphine of France, barely 15 years old. She's writing about a waistcoat she's embroidering for King. And she says, with what I can only imagine was a mixture of humor and despair, I'm embroidering a waistcoat for the King which hasn't progressed much, but I hope that with God's grace it will be finished in a few years. A few years for a waistcoat. Let that sink in for a moment. The future Queen of France, one of the most powerful women in Europe, is spending her precious afternoon hours stitching a piece of clothing that she jokes might take years to complete. And here's the thing, this wasn't unusual. This was expected. This was what accomplished young women did. But before we judge this as a simple waste of time, we need to understand something crucial. Needlework in the 18th century was never just needlework. It was language. It was currency. It was art. It was prison. It was freedom, sometimes all at once. And what women did with their needles tells us more about their lives, their minds, their rebellions than almost anything else. Let's start with the basics. When people in the 18th century talked about a woman doing work, they didn't mean she was employed. They meant she was doing needlework. It's right there in Samuel Johnson's dictionary from 1755. The fourth definition of work is flowers or embroidery of the needle. Not construction work, not farm work, but needlework. That's how central it was to women's lives. And needlework came in two main categories, plain work and fancy work. Plain work was practical sewing, making and mending clothes, sheets, household items. This was necessary labor, and every woman, regardless of class, was expected to know how to do it. Fancy work was decorative, embroidery, elaborate designs, things made to be beautiful rather than useful. Now, here's where it gets interesting. For upper-class women, fancy work was what you did during those afternoon hours. Plain work was beneath you. That's what your maid did. But you sat in your drawing room and created elaborate embroidered pictures. Or you stitched delicate patterns on fine linen. Or you worked on a coverlet that might take you years to complete. For middle-class women, you had to do both. You did the fancy work to prove you had time for such refinements, that you weren't a mere laborer. But you also did practical sewing to save money and show you were a good household manager. It was a delicate balance. And for working-class women, needlework was survival. You sewed for money. You made shirts for pennies apiece. Or you did fine embroidery for wealthy clients. Or you took in mending. Your needle put food on your table. There was nothing leisurely about your afternoon hours with needle and thread. But let's focus on those upper-class women for a moment, because what they created is absolutely stunning. Museums are full of 18th century embroidered pictures, samplers, bed hangings, chair covers, all worked in the tiniest, most intricate stitches you can imagine. The skill required is breathtaking. The patience needed is almost unimaginable. Young girls started learning needlework as early as 5 or 6 years old. They would make what's called a marking sampler first, practicing their letters and numbers so they could mark household linens. Because remember, in a big household with lots of sheets and towels and tablecloths, you needed to mark everything with initials or numbers to keep track of it all. Then, as they got older, around 12 or 13, girls would make decorative samplers. These were like their resumes, their portfolios. A completed sampler was framed and hung in the parlor where any visitor could see it. It proclaimed, "This girl is patient, obedient, skilled. She will make a good wife." Many samplers included verses, often about death and virtue and obedience to God and parents. Cheerful stuff for a 12-year-old to be stitching, right? But these samplers had a purpose beyond just showing skill. They were often all that remained to testify to a girl's existence. The sampler would survive long after she was gone, a tiny fragment of her life stitched into cloth. Girls signed their samplers with their names, ages, and the date. And sometimes when you look at these samplers in museums today, that's all we know about that girl. Her name, her age when she made it, and the fact that she existed long enough to complete those stitches. It's haunting, isn't it? A whole life reduced to a piece of embroidered cloth. But some women took needlework much further. They created elaborate pictures stitched entirely in silk and wool threads. Pastoral scenes with sheep and trees and carefully shaded skies. Biblical scenes. Portraits. These needlework pictures could take years to complete and required artistic skill as well as technical expertise. And here's something fascinating. These pictures were often based on paintings or engravings. A young woman might see a painting she loved and decide to recreate it in thread. She would adapt the composition, choosing colors from her silks, planning how to create shading and depth with different stitches. This was creative work, artistic work, even if it wasn't recognized as such. Women used embroidery frames to keep their work taut. Some were small handheld frames. Others were large frames mounted on wooden stands that sat on the floor. These floor frames were particularly interesting because they allowed a woman to work with both hands, one above the canvas, one below, pushing the needle through and back. This made the work faster and helped prevent the canvas from warping. Now, let's talk about what all this needlework meant. On one level, it was a mark of status. If you had hours to spend on elaborate embroidery, it meant you didn't need to work for money. It meant you had servants to do the actual household labor. Your needlework proved your family's wealth, but it also meant something else, something darker. It kept you busy, it kept you quiet, kept your hands occupied, and theoretically your mind from wandering to dangerous topics. This is what bothered some of the early feminists of the 18th century. Absolutely hated needlework. She saw it as a tool. Hated needlework. She saw it as a tool of oppression. Was a way of keeping them stupid. She wrote that needlework was a way of keeping them stupid. She wrote that needlework contracts their faculties more than any other employment by confining their thoughts to their persons. Think about what she's saying. When you spend hours and hours focused on making tiny, perfect stitches, what happens to your mind? Do you think deep thoughts? Or do you just focus on the next stitch and the next? Wollstonecraft argued that needlework prevented women from developing their intellects. And she had another argument too. She said that middle-class women doing their own fancy needlework was actually harmful to poor women who needed sewing work to survive. If wealthy women would just buy their clothes and linens ready-made, they would provide employment to working-class seamstresses who desperately needed the income. But instead they were doing their own embroidery as a hobby, essentially stealing bread from poor women's mouths. This argument was echoed by Mary Lamb in 1815. Lamb is better known as the sister of Charles Lamb, the essayist. But Mary Lamb has her own terrible story. She was a seamstress doing piecework for poverty wages, making fancy riding coats for wealthy women. The pressure, the poverty, the endless work drove her to madness. In 1796, in a fit of insanity, she stabbed her mother to death. Later, after spending time in an asylum, Mary Lamb wrote an essay called On Needlework. In it, she argued passionately that needlework, especially professional needlework done for pennies, was destroying women's lives. She wanted middle-class women to stop doing their own fancy sewing and instead pay fair wages to working women for it. So needlework was caught in this strange paradox. For wealthy women it was art. For poor women it was grueling labor that barely kept them alive, and for some critics it was a tool used to keep all women, rich and poor, from developing their minds. But here's what those critics missed. Not all women experienced needlework as mindless. For some women, those hours with needle and thread were hours when their minds could wander freely. Their hands were busy with the socially acceptable task, but their minds could go anywhere. Elizabeth Sandwith Drinker, who lived in Philadelphia, kept a detailed diary of her life from 1758 until 1807. She wrote extensively about her needlework, and what comes through in her diary is that she loved it. She took pride in her skill. She enjoyed creating beautiful things. For her, needlework wasn't oppression, it was pleasure. The same was true for Prudence Punderson, who lived around the same time. We have an amazing body of her embroidered works surviving today. She created intricate, beautiful pieces, and she clearly put thought and creativity into them. One of her most famous works is a needlework picture called The First, Second, and Last Scene of Mortality. It shows a baby in a cradle, a woman working at a mirror, and a coffin. It's a meditation on mortality, on the stages of life. That's not mindless work. That's art. That's philosophy expressed in thread. So, which is the truth? Was needlework oppression or pleasure, prison or freedom? The answer is it was both. It depended on who was doing it, why they were doing it, and what choices they had. If you were a wealthy woman who chose to embroider because you enjoyed it, because it was a creative outlet, because you found the work meditative and satisfying, then needlework could be a genuine pleasure. If you were a poor woman doing piecework for starvation wages, then needlework was brutal exploitation. If you were a middle-class woman who had to prove your refinement by doing endless fancy work when you rather be reading or writing or thinking, then needlework could feel like a cage. And sometimes it was all of these things for the same woman at different times. Some afternoons you might love the quiet focus of your needlework. Other afternoons you might resent every stitch, feeling your life slipping away one tiny thread at a time. There's one more aspect of needlework we need to talk about: the quilting bee. This was primarily an American tradition, but it tells us something important about how women used needlework to create community. A quilting bee was a social event where women would gather to work together on a quilt. The hostess would have prepared the quilt top, and on the day of the bee, the women would arrive early, mark out the quilting patterns using plates, thimbles, and teacups as templates, and then spend the day quilting together while exchanging conversation. There was a deadline. The quilt had to be finished before the husbands arrived in the late afternoon for dinner. This gave the work a pleasant urgency, and the whole day was a social event. The hostess could show off her cooking skills with the dinner. After dinner there might be dancing. But during those afternoon hours of quilting, while their hands were busy, women talked. They shared news, offered advice, supported each other through difficulties. These gatherings were crucial for women who might otherwise be isolated on farms or in small communities. The quilting bee was second only to church services in social importance. Think about what that means. For many women, these afternoon gatherings for needlework were the most important social events of their lives. They weren't trivial. They weren't just busy work. They were how women built and maintained the networks that sustained them. So when we look at all that 18th century needlework, those samplers and embroidered pictures and quilts, we need to see them as more than just pretty objects. We need to see the hours of life they represent. The afternoons spent stitching, the thoughts that passed through the maker's mind as her needle went in and out, thousands and thousands of times. We need to see the skill, the patience, the artistry. But we also need to see the constraints, the limited options, the way that something beautiful can also be a burden. We need to see both the joy and the oppression, the creativity and the control, the freedom and the prison. Because that's what those quiet afternoons of needlework really were: complicated, contradictory, full of both beauty and pain. Just like the women who sat with their needles, creating small worlds in thread, while the larger world told them to sit still, stay quiet, and keep their hands busy. And speaking of complexity, speaking of ways women navigated their constrained worlds, we haven't yet talked about one of the most powerful tools they had. Something that could be kept private or made public, something that could be destroyed or preserved, something that gave women a voice when they were supposed to be silent. We need to talk about letters, about how women used the written word to build communities across distance, to preserve their thoughts for posterity, and to claim a kind of immortality in a world that wanted to forget they had minds at all. So stay with me as we explore the secret life of 18th century women's correspondence. Picture a young woman sitting at her writing desk on a quiet afternoon in 1746. The light is fading, candles haven't yet been lit, and she's just received a letter that will change how she thinks about herself forever. The letter is from Samuel Richardson, the famous novelist, and in it he writes something revolutionary. The pen is almost the only means a very modest and diffident lady, who in company will not attempt to glare, has to show herself, and that she has a mind. Read that again. That she has a mind. In 1746 this needed to be said. It needed to be written down and sent to a young woman as if it were a revelation, because the default assumption was that women didn't really have minds. Not in the way men did. They had feelings, certainly. They had virtue or the lack of it. But minds, intellects, thoughts worth recording. That was radical. And yet the 18th century was what historians now call the golden age of letter writing. Between the establishment of the post office in 1660, the rise of literacy, and the growth of the middle class, more people were writing more letters than ever before. And women, those supposedly mindless creatures, were writing letters that would fill libraries, that would preserve entire networks of thought and feeling, that would give us windows into their worlds that we would have no other way to see. Let me tell you about the sheer scale of this. When Elizabeth Montagu died in 1802, she left behind more than 6,000 letters. 6,000. Can you imagine? That's a lifetime of correspondence, of thoughts, of relationships, all preserved in ink on paper. And she wasn't unusual. Many 18th century women who had the education and the means wrote hundreds or thousands of letters over their lifetimes. But here's what makes this fascinating. Letters in the 18th century existed in a strange space between public and private. They weren't like our text messages or emails, quick and disposable. Writing a letter took time, took materials that cost money, took thought and effort. And once sent, a letter entered a world where privacy was uncertain at best. You see, in many households, letters were considered entertainment. When a letter arrived, especially an interesting one, it might be read aloud to the whole family or even to guests. In Samuel Richardson's novel Sir Charles Grandison, the heroine Harriet knows that her letters to her cousin will be read aloud to the family. So she marks with square brackets the passages she once kept private. Think about that for a moment. You're writing a letter, pouring out your thoughts, but you know that multiple people will read it, will hear it read aloud. How does that change what you write? How much can you really say? And yet, women found ways to be honest, to be real, to share their true thoughts in letters, even knowing they might be shared. Because letters were also the only space where women could write in their own voices, could express themselves without having to conform to the conventions of published writing, which was dominated by men and by male expectations. Letter writing became so important that there were manuals to teach people how to do it. In 1741, Samuel Richardson published Familiar Letters on Important Occasions, a guidebook with model letters for every situation you could imagine. Letters of condolence, letters requesting payment of debts, letters of advice from fathers to sons, from mothers to daughters. There were even letters showing how to politely refuse an unwanted suitor or how to ask someone to settle their account with. These manuals were popular because letter writing was a skill, an art form even. You had to know the proper form, the right tone, the appropriate length. A letter that was too short seemed rude, like you couldn't be bothered. A letter that was too long seemed presumptuous, like you thought your thoughts were more interesting than they probably were. But for women especially, letter writing became something more than just following the rules in a manual. It became a way to maintain relationships, to build networks, to participate in intellectual life despite being shut out of universities and coffee houses and most other spaces where ideas were exchanged. Let me share a specific example that shows how powerful this could be. Remember Elizabeth Robinson, the young woman we talked about earlier who was isolated during the smallpox outbreak. She and her friend Anne Donnellan were reading the same books at the same time and writing to each other about what they were reading. They were having book discussions through letters, sharing their thoughts on Plutarch and Cicero, challenging each other's interpretations, growing intellectually together despite being physically apart. This wasn't unusual. Women all over England and Europe were doing the same thing. They were creating what we might call reading groups or study circles, but conducted entirely through correspondence. They would recommend books to each other, discuss what they'd read, debate ideas, all through letters that went back and forth, sometimes for decades. And these weren't trivial books they were discussing. They were reading philosophy, history, science, theology. They were engaging with the most challenging intellectual material of their time. But they had to do it privately, through letters, because there were no public spaces where they could have these conversations face to face. Well, that's not entirely true. Some women did create spaces for intellectual conversation. The Blue Stocking Society, which Elizabeth Montagu helped found, was one. But even there, letters played a crucial role. The friendships that sustained the Blue Stockings, the ideas they developed, the support they gave each other, all of this was maintained through constant correspondence. And here's something that might surprise you. These women were very conscious of writing for posterity. They knew their letters might be published after their deaths. Some of them even planned for it, kept copies of their letters, organized their correspondence, prepared it for eventual publication. Elizabeth Rowe, a poet and writer who died in 1737, had her letters published posthumously. They became bestsellers. People loved reading the supposedly private thoughts of this pious, learned woman. The letters gave readers an intimate view into her mind, her daily life, her spiritual struggles. Catherine Cockburn, a philosopher and playwright, maintained extensive philosophical correspondence throughout her life, even during years when she wasn't publishing. When her collected works were finally published in 1751 after her death, much of the volume consisted of her letters, which showed her continuing engagement with philosophy and theology throughout decades when the public might have thought she was silent. Elizabeth Carter, one of the most learned women of the 18th century, who translated the Greek philosopher Epictetus, conducted philosophical and theological debates through letters with both men and women. Her letters, published in 1809, showed a mind every bit as capable as her male correspondence, but also showed the constraints she worked under. She couldn't attend university. She couldn't publish controversial theological views under her own name as easily as a man could, but in letters she could say what she thought. Now, let's talk about the physical act of writing letters in the 18th century, because it wasn't as simple as sitting down with a pen and paper. First, you needed the materials. Paper was expensive. Ink had to be mixed. Pens were quills that had to be cut and sharpened regularly. You needed a writing desk, good light, time when you wouldn't be interrupted. For women, finding that time and space could be challenging. If you were managing a household, you had constant demands on your attention. Servants needed direction. Children need care. Visitors might call at any moment. The afternoon hours, those hours between the morning activities and the evening dinner, were often the only time a woman could sit down to write. Some women had their own private closets or boudoirs where they could retreat to write, but many didn't. They had to write in common rooms where they might be interrupted at any moment. This is why so many women's letters mention being interrupted, having to put down their pen because a visitor arrived or a child needed something or dinner was ready. And then there was the question of what you could say in a letter. Because remember, privacy wasn't guaranteed. Husbands sometimes read their wives' letters. Fathers read their daughters' letters. Even if they didn't read them, the knowledge that they could had a chilling effect. There are cases of women who maintained secret correspondences, hiding their letters, using trusted servants to post them, finding ways to communicate that wouldn't be monitored. These were often romantic correspondences, women writing to men they loved but weren't allowed to marry, or conducting flirtations that society would condemn. But even non-romantic letters could be problematic. If a woman expressed political opinions that her husband didn't share, that could cause. If she complained about her circumstances too openly, that could be seen as improper. Women had to be strategic about what they wrote and how they wrote it. And yet, when you read 18th century women's letters, what comes through again and again is their honesty, their wit, their intelligence, their full humanity. They found ways to be themselves on paper even under constraints. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, for instance, wrote letters from Turkey in 1716 to 1718, where she was living while her husband was ambassador. These letters are amazing. She describes Turkish culture with curiosity and respect. She writes about visiting a Turkish bath and seeing women of all classes bathing together, something that shocked and fascinated her. She learned about inoculation against smallpox from Turkish doctors and brought the practice back to England, potentially saving thousands of lives. Her letters were published in 1762 after her death, and they became hugely influential. They were read as both travel writing and anthropological observation. They helped English readers see Turkish culture as something other than barbaric, and they established Lady Mary as a literary figure, a woman whose observations and thoughts were worth reading. But here's something interesting. Even as women's letters were being published and read and admired, there was still suspicion about women writing letters at all. There was worry about what women might say in their private correspondence. Controlling husbands and fathers were concerned about the potential for secrecy, for communication that happened outside their oversight. This anxiety shows up in the literature of the period. Richardson's novels Pamela and Clarissa are both epistolary novels, novels told through letters. and in both, the heroines get into trouble partly because of their letter writing. Pamela writes letters to her parents describing her employer's attempts to seduce her, and he tries to intercept them. Clarissa's family reads her letters and uses them to try to control her. These novels were incredibly popular, and they both feature young women who are praised for their letter-writing abilities. They write beautifully, expressively, virtuously. But they also face punishment and danger partly because of their writing. It's as if the novels are both celebrating and warning about the power of women's letters. And letters were powerful. Through letters, women maintained friendships across distance and across years. Through letters, they participated in intellectual discussions they couldn't have in person. Through letters, they expressed feelings that would be inappropriate to voice aloud. Through letters, they created records of their lives and thoughts that would outlive them. There's a wonderful essay from the early 19th century by Charles Lamb, the brother of Mary Lamb we talked about earlier. He writes about the decline of letter writing and his nostalgia for the great letter writers of the previous. Shall we receive no more chatty communications from the other side of the globe? Are we to be cut off from all friendly intercourse with distant friends? What he's mourning is the personal, intimate letter. The kind of letter that takes time to write and that feels like a conversation on paper. The kind of letter that women in the 18th century excelled at writing because women had practice at this. They had practice at maintaining relationships through words, at expressing emotion on paper, at creating intimacy through correspondence. For many men, letters were primarily business communications. For women, letters were how they maintained their social and emotional lives. And women were aware of this skill. They took pride in it. Being known as a good correspondent was a compliment. Having your letters praised was a genuine honor, and some women's letters were so admired that they were passed around or copied, shared beyond the original recipient. This created a manuscript culture, a network of communication that existed alongside published literature but was separate from it. Women would copy poems into their letters, share recipes, pass along news and gossip, all creating a web of information and connection that bound them together. Do you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of social media today. The way we maintain friendships online, share our thoughts and experiences, create communities across distance. The technology is different, but the human impulse is the same. We want to connect, to share, to be known, to know others. And for 18th century women, letters were their social media. Letters were how they stayed connected in a world that tried to isolate them in their separate homes, their separate domestic spheres. Letters were how they proved to themselves and to each other, and eventually to history, that they had minds, that their thoughts mattered, that they were more than just decorative objects or household managers. Through letters, women created an entire literary tradition. The epistolary novels written in letter form became hugely popular in the 18th century, partly because women were such skilled letter writers. Readers wanted to read fictional letters because they were already reading real letters and finding them fascinating. And through letters, women left us a record of their lives that we wouldn't otherwise have. Diaries were relatively rare. Most women didn't publish books, but many women wrote letters. And those letters, thousands and thousands of them preserved in archives and libraries and private collections, give us our most intimate view of what life was like for women in the 18th century.
When you read these letters, you feel like you know these women. You hear their voices. You understand their frustrations and their joys, their daily concerns and their deepest thoughts. You see their humor, their intelligence, their creativity, their full human complexity.
That's what those afternoon hours of letter writing accomplished. They created a space where women could be fully themselves, where they could think and feel and express without having to perform the role of proper lady, where they could forge friendships based on intellectual connection, not just social obligation, where they could leave a mark on the world, even if that world tried to erase them. The pen really was, as Richardson wrote, the only means many women had to show they had minds. And they used that pen brilliantly, filling pages and pages with their thoughts, creating a legacy that would influence everything from feminist movements to literary traditions to our very understanding of what it meant to be a woman in the 18th century. But words on paper weren't the only way women expressed themselves during those quiet afternoons. There was another art form, another skill that was considered essential for accomplished ladies, another way to fill the hours and show you refinement. And this one filled the air with sound, turned drawing rooms into concert halls, and gave women a socially acceptable way to display emotion and passion that would have been scandalous in any other context. We need to talk about music, about the harpsichord and the harp, and the extraordinary world of sound that women created in their afternoon hours. So let's continue our journey into these hidden realms of 18th century women's lives. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you can hear it. The bright, crystalline sound of a harpsichord filling an 18th century drawing room, each note precise, almost bell-like, as a young woman's fingers move across the keys. She's been practicing this sonata for months, and this afternoon, finally, she'll play it for guests. Her mother sits nearby, pretending to do needlework, but actually listening critically for any mistakes. The young woman's future might depend on how well she plays these next few minutes. Because in the marriage market of 18th century Europe, musical skill wasn't just an accomplishment, it was currency. But here's what fascinates me. While everyone was watching her perform, while they were judging whether she played well enough to be considered an accomplished lady, something else was happening. Through music, women found one of the few socially acceptable ways to express deep emotion, to command attention, to take up space in a way they couldn't do anywhere else. The harpsichord was supposed to make them marriageable, but for some women, it became something much more powerful than that. Let's start with the basics. In the 18th century, particularly for middle and upper-class women, being able to play a keyboard instrument was considered absolutely essential. It was right up there with needlework and dancing and drawing. If you couldn't play the harpsichord, or later in the century the piano, you were considered uneducated, unrefined, not fit for polite society. And this wasn't optional. Parents invested significant money in music education for their daughters. They bought expensive instruments. They hired music masters to come to the house for lessons. They made sure their daughters practiced every single day. Because musical ability was seen as a direct reflection on the family's status and wealth. Think about what this meant. A harpsichord was a massive, expensive piece of furniture. It dominated whatever room it was in. If your family owned a harpsichord, and especially if it was beautifully decorated, it announced to every visitor, "We have money, we have culture, we have refined daughters." The instrument itself was a status symbol before anyone even played a note, and the harpsichords themselves were often works of art. They were decorated with paintings, inlaid with precious materials covered in elaborate carvings. Some of the finest artists of the age painted harpsichord soundboards with flowers, birds, mythological scenes. These weren't just instruments. They were display pieces, objects of beauty meant to show off the owner's wealth and taste. But let's talk about what it actually meant to learn music in the 18th century. If you were a girl from a family that could afford it, you probably started lessons around age 7 or 8. Your teacher would most likely be male, which created an interesting social situation. Here was a man, often a professional musician or composer, coming regularly to your home to spend time alone with you. This was one of the few contexts where a young woman and an unrelated man could be alone together without it being scandalous. The music lesson was a legitimate, respectable reason for such interaction, but it also created opportunities for less appropriate interactions. There are paintings from the era that play with this tension, showing music teachers leaning very close to their female students, supposedly to see the music better, but with clear romantic or sexual undertones. In fact, in Dutch paintings of the 17th century, which influenced 18th century English culture, music lessons were often depicted as scenes of seduction. There's a famous painting by Gerard ter Borch showing a young woman at a clavichord with cymbals in the room suggesting her virtue is at risk. Music and desire, music and romance. These were linked in the cultural imagination. But most music lessons, of course, were just lessons. Hours and hours of practice, learning scales and exercises, working through increasingly complex pieces. And the goal was always the same, to be able to perform competently for guests, to display your accomplishment, to prove you were worth marrying. Now, here's something interesting. The harpsichord was the dominant keyboard instrument through most of the 18th century, but it worked very differently from the piano. When you press a key on the harpsichord, a small piece called a plectrum plucks the string. It's a mechanical action, and it produces the same volume no matter how hard or soft you press the key. You can't make the harpsichord louder or softer by varying your touch. This meant that the expression in harpsichord playing came from other elements: timing, ornamentation, the use of different stops that changed the sound. It required a very precise, controlled technique, and this was seen as appropriately feminine. The harpsichord was delicate, refined, controlled, just like a lady should be. The piano, which was invented around 1700 but didn't become popular until the later part of the 18th century, was different. On a piano, you can play soft or loud, depending on how hard you strike the keys. In fact, the original name was pianoforte, which means soft loud in Italian. The piano allowed for much more dramatic expression, more emotional range. And as the piano became more popular, there was actually some debate about whether it was appropriate for young ladies. Some people thought the piano encouraged too much passion, too much dramatic expression. Preferred the controlled, refined sound of the harpsichord. But gradually the piano won out, and by the early 1800s, it had almost completely replaced the harpsichord in drawing rooms across Europe. Let me tell you about a woman who shows us what musical skill could really mean. Jane Savage was born around 1752 or 1753. Her father, William Savage, was a prominent musician in London, a singing teacher and composer. Jane grew up surrounded by music and became an accomplished musician herself. She played, she composed, she taught, and she published her compositions. This was unusual. Most women who composed music didn't publish it. They might share their compositions in manuscript form with friends or perform them in private, but publishing was a step into the public sphere that many women avoided. But Jane Savage published several sets of songs and keyboard pieces. She made her work public. She claimed the identity of composer, not just performer. Now she didn't become famous. History has largely forgotten her, but the fact that she could publish, that she could earn money from her compositions, that she could have a professional musical life, tells us something important. For women with sufficient talent and determination, music could be more than just an accomplishment to attract a husband. It could be a genuine creative outlet, even a profession. But for every Jane Savage, there were hundreds of women whose musical abilities remained within the domestic sphere. They played for their families, for guests at tea parties, for small gatherings. Their music filled drawing rooms but rarely went beyond those walls. And yet, I think there's something powerful about that too. Because when a woman sat down at her harpsichord or piano in the afternoon and began to play, something shifted in the room. Everyone had to be quiet. Everyone had to listen. For those minutes when she was performing, she commanded attention in a way that was otherwise almost impossible for a woman. Think about it. In conversation, women were expected to be modest, to defer to men, to not speak too loudly or too much. In their daily activities, they were supposed to be almost invisible, smoothly managing households without making a fuss. But when they were performing music, they were the center of attention. Everyone's eyes were on them. Everyone was listening to them. They briefly had power, and music allowed for the expression of emotion that would be inappropriate in other contexts. A woman couldn't stand up in mixed company and deliver a passionate speech. She couldn't argue vehemently about politics or philosophy, but she could play music that expressed passion, drama, sadness, joy, all the emotion she had to keep controlled the rest of the time. The harp was another popular instrument for women, especially in the later 18th century. The harp had a romantic, almost mystical quality. There's a beautiful portrait by Joshua Reynolds of the Countess of Eglinton playing the harp. In 1777, she's dressed in flowing robes. Lost in the music, and she looks like she's in a different world, lost in the music. The harp was seen as particularly feminine, perhaps because of its association with ancient Greek lyres and with angels in religious art. A woman playing the harp was the very image of refined spiritual femininity. And the physical act of playing it, reaching around the instrument to pluck the strings, was considered graceful and beautiful to watch. But the harp was also challenging to play. It required strength in the fingers, good hand-eye coordination, a strong sense of rhythm. It wasn't easy. Women who played the harp well had genuine skill, but that skill was always framed as an accomplishment, never as professional expertise. The violin was more controversial. Some people thought it was too masculine an instrument for women. The way you had to hold it up against your shoulder and chin was considered potentially ungraceful. And there was something about the soaring, crying sound of the violin that seemed too passionate, too emotional for proper young ladies. And yet some women did play the violin. It was considered acceptable in some contexts, particularly in more progressive circles. The fact that there was debate about it tells us something about how carefully every aspect of women's behavior was policed, right down to which musical instruments they could play. Now, let's talk about what all this music practice actually meant in terms of time. A young woman learning music would be expected to practice at least an hour a day, often more. Some practiced 2 or 3 hours daily. That's a significant portion of the afternoon, every afternoon, year after year, all devoted to developing musical skill. And what did she get from all this practice? Well, if she was lucky, she genuinely enjoyed music. She found pleasure in learning new pieces, in improving her technique, in the act of making music itself. For some women, those practice hours were the best part of their day, a time when they could focus on something beautiful, something that required all their concentration and gave them a sense of achievement. But for others, it was a burden. Another task on the endless list of things an accomplished lady must do. Another way to be judged and potentially found wanting. Another performance to give. Another way to prove your worth to a society that valued you primarily for your marriageability. There's a scene in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice that captures this perfectly. Elizabeth Bennet is asked to play and sing at a party. She does so reluctantly, knowing she's not particularly skilled, and while she's playing, people barely listen. They continue their conversations, only occasionally glancing her way. Her performance is just background entertainment, barely noticed. This was probably the reality for most women's musical performances. They weren't grand concerts, they were drawing room entertainment. People chatted while they played. Only when they made a mistake did anyone really pay attention. The music was expected to be pleasant but not too demanding, skilled but not so brilliant that it made guests uncomfortable. And yet some women transcended this. Some women were so talented that when they played, everyone really did stop and listen. Some women found in music a genuine calling, a way to express themselves that went beyond social expectations. There's a fascinating story about Teresa Lanti, an opera singer who appears in Casanova's memoirs. She performed as a male castrato singer for years before her true identity was discovered. Think about what that means. She was so talented, so committed to her musical career that she disguised her gender to pursue it, because as a woman, she would have had limited opportunities. As a supposed castrato, she could perform in operas, travel, have a real musical career. When her deception was discovered, it caused a scandal. But it also revealed something important. Women could have the same musical talent as men, could perform at the same level, could be just as professional. Not natural ability. Queen Charlotte, wife of King George III, was a skilled musician, including the young Mozart. There's a portrait of her with her daughter Charlotte, the Princess Royal, where the princess is holding up some knotting, that lacework we talked about earlier. But there's also sheet music visible and classical busts and books in the background. The portrait is carefully constructed to show these royal women as both properly feminine and seriously intellectual and artistic. This was the balance women had to strike. They had to be musical enough to be accomplished, but not so serious about music that they seemed unfeminine or threatening. They had to perform gracefully, but not so brilliantly that they overshadowed the men in the room. They had to practice for hours, but make it all seem effortless and natural. And here's something that strikes me as deeply unfair. While women were expected to play music as one of many accomplishments, male musicians were professionals. They were composers, performers, music teachers. They earned their living from music and were respected for it. But a woman who took music that seriously was considered odd, unwomanly, potentially unmarriageable. So most women kept their musical ambitions within acceptable bounds. They played for their families and friends. They perhaps composed a few small pieces that they shared in manuscript form but never published. They taught their own daughters to play. And their musical talents, which might have been extraordinary, remained confined to drawing rooms. But I want to end this section on a more hopeful note, because even though most women's musical achievements remained private, even though they weren't recognized, as professional musicians they still created something valuable. They filled their homes with music. They passed down musical skills to the next generation. They kept classical music alive in the domestic sphere. And for some women, those afternoon hours of music practice were genuinely joyful. They loved the challenge of learning a difficult piece. They loved the feeling of their fingers moving across the keys, creating sound out of silence. They loved being able to play music that moved them, that expressed feelings they couldn't voice in words. Music gave women a language beyond words, a way to speak that didn't require justification or explanation. When they played, they didn't have to explain themselves, didn't have to make themselves smaller or quieter. They could just play, and the music could be as loud or as soft, as passionate or as controlled, as they chose to make it. And perhaps that's the real legacy of all those afternoon hours spent at harpsichords and pianos and harps. Not the performances at tea parties, not the displays of accomplishment, but the simple fact that for a little while each day women could make beauty, could create something that hadn't existed before, could be artists in a world that rarely recognized them as such. But making music wasn't the only way women created beauty and expressed themselves during those quiet afternoons. There were gathering places, intellectual spaces where women didn't just entertain but actively shaped culture and ideas. Spaces where the rules were different, where women could speak and be heard on terms that approached equality. We need to explore the world of salons, those remarkable afternoon gatherings that became incubators for some of the most important ideas of the age. So let's continue our journey and discover how drawing rooms became centers of intellectual revolution. What if I told you that some of the most important ideas of the Enlightenment, ideas that would eventually lead to Revolutions and reshape Western civilization were discussed and developed in drawing rooms over tea and conversation, led by women who weren't allowed to attend university or publish under their own names. What if I told you that while men were meeting in coffee houses and clubs, women were creating their own intellectual spaces that were in some ways even more influential? This is the hidden story of the salon, and it's far more revolutionary than history books usually admit. Let me take you to Paris first, because that's where salon culture reached its highest, most glittering peak. Picture the drawing room of Madame de Pompadour in the 1750s. She's the official mistress of King Louis XV, which gives her enormous power at court. But she's not just using that power for personal gain. She's one of the greatest patrons of art and culture in European history. Her afternoons are filled with gatherings where philosophers, artists, writers, and scientists mix with aristocrats and Voltaire is there, discussing his latest ideas about tolerance and reason. Diderot is there, working on his revolutionary encyclopedia. Artists show their latest work. Musicians perform. And Madame de Pompadour orchestrates it all, guiding conversation, introducing people who should know each other, supporting artists and thinkers whose work she believes in. And here's what's crucial. She's not just hosting, she's participating. She's asking questions, offering opinions, challenging ideas. In her drawing room, at least, she's recognized as an intellectual equal. The men there don't talk down to her or dismiss her thoughts because she's a woman. They engage with her seriously because she's demonstrated her intelligence and because she holds power. But let's be honest about what made this possible. Madame de Pompadour could create this space partly because of her unusual position. As the king's favorite, she had money, status, and protection that most women could never dream. She could afford to be unconventional because she was already outside the normal rules of respectable society. For most women who wanted to create intellectual gathering spaces, the challenge was different. They had to work within the rules of respectability while still pushing boundaries. They had to make their gatherings seem like ordinary social events while actually making them something much more significant. This is exactly what the Blue Stockings did in England. Elizabeth Montagu, whose letters and reading habits we've already talked about, became the center of a circle of intellectual women and men who met regularly in drawing rooms in London to discuss literature, philosophy, science, and ideas. But they were very careful about how they presented these gatherings. They called them conversation parties, not salons, because salons sounded too French, too potentially scandalous for proper English society. They served tea and light refreshments, just like at any polite social gathering. They made sure to invite both men and women because a gathering of only women might seem suspicious. And they had strict rules, no card games, which were the usual entertainment at social gatherings, and absolutely no flirting. Now, you might think that sounds incredibly boring. No games, no flirting, just sitting around talking about books and ideas. But for the people who attended, it was thrilling because where else could they have these conversations? Where else could women and men discuss philosophy together as intellectual equals? Where else could women demonstrate their learning without being mocked for being unfeminine? The name Blue Stocking itself has an interesting origin. At one of their gatherings, a man named Benjamin Stillingfleet wore blue worsted stockings instead of the formal black silk stockings that were expected in polite society. Someone made a joke about it, and the name stuck. It was meant as an insult, suggesting that these people were so focused on intellectual matters that they didn't care about proper fashion. But the Blue Stockings embraced the name. They wore it proudly, and they needed that pride because they faced constant mockery. Satirists published cruel cartoons showing blue stocking women as ugly, unfeminine, pedantic. They were portrayed as women who couldn't get husbands because they were too intellectual, too serious, too boring. The message was clear. Women who wanted to use their minds were betraying their true feminine nature. But the Blue Stockings persisted, and gradually they changed attitudes. They proved that women could engage with serious intellectual topics. They created a space where female learning was valued and encouraged. And they built networks of support and friendship that would sustain them through decades of work. Let me tell you about one specific afternoon gathering that captures what these salons could be. It's sometime in the 1770s, and Elizabeth Montagu is hosting one of her conversation parties. The guests include both men and women, some of them aristocrats, others scholars or writers. They're discussing a recent publication about ancient Greek philosophy. One of the women present, Elizabeth Carter, has actually translated the works of the Greek philosopher Epictetus from the original Greek. This is a major scholarly achievement. Most men of the time couldn't read ancient Greek, let alone translate it. But Elizabeth Carter can and has, and her translation is respected by serious scholars. At this gathering, she's explaining some of the nuances of Epictetus's thought, discussing how certain Greek words don't translate easily into English, debating with the male scholars present about interpretation and meaning. And everyone in the room is listening to her, taking her seriously, engaging with her ideas. Can you imagine what this must have felt like for the women present? To be in a space where their thoughts mattered, where they could speak without having. To be modest or deferential, where their learning was an asset rather than a liability. These afternoon gatherings were an oasis in a desert of intellectual restriction. But salon culture wasn't the same everywhere. In France, salons tended to be more mixed socially and more politically engaged. In England, they were more careful about respectability and tended to focus on literature and philosophy rather than politics, at least openly. In different cities and countries, salons took different forms, adapted to local customs and restrictions. What they all had in common was this: they were spaces created and controlled by women. The hostess decided who was invited, set the topics of conversation, established the rules. In her drawing room during those afternoon hours, she had authority. This was rare, this was precious, and the women who created these spaces knew it. Now, let's talk about the physical space of these gatherings, because it mattered. Most salons took place in drawing rooms, those formal reception rooms that were designed for entertaining guests. The furniture was arranged to encourage conversation, with chairs and sofas positioned in circles or semicircles so people could see each other's faces. The lighting was important too. Afternoon gatherings had natural light from windows, which was considered more flattering than candlelight and also easier on the eyes for reading. If a gathering extended into evening, candles would be lit, but carefully placed to create an atmosphere that was both elegant and conducive to serious conversation. And the decoration of the room itself sent messages. Books on display showed that this was a household that valued learning. Art on the walls demonstrated cultural sophistication. Musical instruments suggested accomplishment and refinement. Every detail was chosen to create an environment where intellectual conversation felt natural and appropriate. The hostess herself was the key to everything. She had to have enough social status to attract interesting guests, enough money to provide refreshments and maintain an elegant space, enough learning to guide conversations intelligently, and enough social skill to manage different personalities and keep discussions productive. It was in many ways a performance. The hostess had to seem effortlessly gracious while actually working very hard to make everything run smoothly. She had to be knowledgeable enough to hold her own in discussions, but not so aggressive in her opinions that she made male guests uncomfortable. She had to be welcoming to everyone while also maintaining standards about who could attend. And there was always the risk of scandal. If a salon became known as a place where dangerous ideas were discussed too openly, where women were too bold in their opinions, where the boundaries of propriety were pushed too far, it could be shut down by social disapproval or even official censure. This happens sometimes. There are cases of women who were socially ostracized because their salons were considered too radical. Anne Hutchinson in colonial America was excommunicated from her church for holding religious discussions in her home. Anne Askew in 16th century England was tried for heresy and executed. These were extreme cases, but they showed what could happen to women who were too outspoken, who created spaces where dangerous ideas could flourish. So most salon hostesses were strategic. They pushed boundaries, but carefully. They created space for intellectual discussion, but within forms that seemed respectable. They were revolutionaries in elegant dresses serving tea, while plotting the overthrow of intellectual restrictions on women. Here's something I find particularly interesting. Many of the ideas that came out of salon conversations eventually made their way into published works. Male philosophers and writers who attended salons would incorporate ideas they'd heard there into their books and essays. Sometimes they credited the women who had contributed to their thinking. Often they didn't. So women's intellectual contributions were often invisible in the historical record, filtered through the published works of men who had the freedom to write and publish that women lacked. This means that when we read Enlightenment philosophy, when we study the intellectual history of the 18th century, we're often reading ideas that were shaped by women's contributions in salons, even if their names aren't on the title pages. But some women did publish. Elizabeth Montagu published an essay on Shakespeare that was taken seriously by scholars. Other blue-stocking women published poetry, essays, translations. It was harder for them than for men. They faced more criticism and mockery, but they did it. The salon gave them the confidence and the intellectual community they needed to take that step into the public sphere. And the friendships formed in salons sustained women through difficult times. When you found other women who valued learning, who took ideas seriously, who supported your intellectual ambitions, you weren't alone anymore. You had a community, you had people who understood you. There's a touching series of letters between blue-stocking women supporting each other through various crises. One woman's husband dying, another dealing with financial troubles, a third struggling with depression. And in all these letters, alongside the emotional support, there's also intellectual engagement. They're still discussing books they've read, ideas they're thinking about, problems they're trying to solve. The intellectual life and the emotional life are woven together. This, I think, is what made salons so powerful and so threatening. They created communities of women who supported each other, who validated each other's intelligence, who gave each other permission to think and speak and write. They created networks that could challenge the status quo, even if that wasn't always the explicit goal. And they trained women in the skills that would later become politically important. How to speak persuasively, how to organize groups, how to build coalitions, how to navigate social politics, how to get things done within restrictive systems. All of these skills developed in drawing room conversations about literature and philosophy would later be used by women fighting for education rights, for legal rights, for the vote. The salon was a school for revolution, even if it looked like just another afternoon social gathering. Behind the tea and the polite conversation, women were learning to use their voices, to trust their minds, to imagine that they might be more than what society told them they had to be. Now, I want to be clear about something. Salon culture was primarily available to wealthy women. You needed money, leisure time, education, and social connections to participate. Working-class women, women who spent their afternoons laboring for wages, women who didn't have drawing rooms or servants or the education to discuss philosophy, these women were excluded from salon culture. So we can't romanticize salons as universally liberating. They were exclusive spaces that reinforced class divisions even as they challenged gender restrictions. The women who benefited from salon culture were privileged in many ways, even if they were disadvantaged by their gender. But the ideas that came out of salons, the arguments for women's education and women's intellectual capabilities, these eventually benefited a broader range of women. The blue stockings and other salon women helped lay the groundwork for women's education, for women's entry into professions, for women's public voices. They weren't trying to liberate all women necessarily, but the changes they helped bring about had wider effects than they might have imagined. As the 18th century progressed and turned into the 19th, salon culture evolved. It became somewhat more accepted for women to be educated and intellectual, but it also became more codified, more restricted in some ways. The spontaneous, boundary-pushing quality of the early salons gave way to more formal, more conventional gatherings. But the memory of what salons had been, the idea that women could create intellectual spaces, that they could discuss ideas as equals with men, that they could contribute to the cultural and intellectual life of their societies. This memory persisted and inspired the generations of women who came after, who fought for education, for professional opportunities, for political rights. Every time a woman stood up to speak in public in the 19th or 20th century, every time a woman published a book, or taught a class, or gave a lecture, she was building on the foundation laid by those drawing room gatherings in the 18th century. Those afternoon conversations over tea were training grounds for revolution, even if the women participating didn't always realize it. And perhaps that's the most subversive thing about salon culture. It took the most domestic, the most feminine, the most socially acceptable setting, the drawing room tea party, and turned it into something radical. It proved that women didn't need to reject femininity to be intelligent, didn't need to abandon domestic spaces to participate in intellectual life. They could work within the system while subtly undermining it, could use the tools they were given in ways their creators never intended. Now, as we move through these afternoon hours, as we explore all the different ways women filled their time, we need to talk about activities that took them out of those drawing rooms at least sometimes. Because not all of women's afternoons were spent indoors. There were moments when they could step outside, when they could move their bodies, when they could experience a different kind of freedom under the open sky. We need to explore the world of outdoor activities, of walking and gardens, and the rare breath of fresh air. Women could claim as their own, let's step outside together and see what we find. There's a line from Jane Austen's letters that I think about often. She writes about her morning routine, and she mentions taking brisk walks in the garden before breakfast. Brisk walks. Not gentle strolls, not delicate promenades, but brisk walks. I love that word choice. It suggests movement, purpose, energy. It suggests a woman who wanted to move her body, to feel her muscles working, to breathe deeply and walk fast enough that her heart rate increased. And this was considered slightly unusual, even eccentric, because in the 18th century, women weren't really supposed to be brisk about anything. They were supposed to move gracefully, slowly, delicately. They were supposed to glide rather than stride. The idea of a respectable woman walking briskly, walking for exercise, walking just because it felt good to move, this was unconventional enough that Austen felt it was worth mentioning in her letters. So let's talk about the complicated relationship 18th century women had with outdoor activities, with movement, with their own physical bodies. Because this is another area where they had to navigate impossible contradictions. They were supposed to be healthy enough to bear children, but not so athletic that they seemed unfeminine. They were supposed to get fresh air, but not so much that their skin became unfashionably tanned. They were supposed to enjoy nature, but only in carefully controlled, socially acceptable ways. Let's start with the most basic outdoor activity, walking. For most of human history, walking was simply how people got from place to place. But in the 18th century, among the upper classes, walking for its own sake, walking for pleasure or exercise, became something new and slightly controversial. For men, taking long walks in the countryside was becoming fashionable, associated with romantic poets and with a new appreciation for nature. But for women, it was more complicated. A woman walking alone, especially in the countryside, was potentially at risk. She might be seen as improper, or she might actually be in danger from men who assumed a woman alone was fair game for harassment, so women who wanted to walk had to do it within constraints. They could walk in their own gardens or in public parks where they would be seen and thus protected by social observation. They could walk with companions, with family members or trusted servants. They could take their brisk walks early in the morning like Jane Austen, when fewer people were around to judge. And there were rules about how to walk. A lady didn't swing her arms too vigorously. She didn't take steps that were too long. She certainly didn't run, except perhaps to escape immediate danger. Her walking pace should be moderate, her posture upright, her expression pleasant. Walking was exercise, yes, but it was also a performance of femininity. But within these constraints, walking gave women something precious, a reason to be outside, to be moving, to be alone with their thoughts. In the garden, walking the same paths she'd walked hundreds of times before, a woman could think without interruption. She could process her feelings, work through problems, compose letters or stories in her head, or simply enjoy the physical sensation of movement and fresh air. Gardens themselves were important spaces for women. If you were wealthy enough to have a garden, particularly a large one with paths and seating areas, you had a semi-private outdoor space. It was still your property, still controlled, but it gave you access to nature without having to leave the safety of your own grounds. And women were often actively involved in garden design and maintenance. Not the heavy digging and planting that was done by male gardeners, but the planning, the choosing of plants, the arrangement of flower beds. These were considered appropriate feminine activities. Gardens were an extension of the home and therefore within women's proper sphere. Some women became genuinely expert in botanical knowledge. They studied plant properties and growth requirements. Botany was considered an acceptable science for women, partly because it could be pursued in gardens and didn't require dangerous fieldwork or unseemly laboratory experiments. Women would collect plant specimens, press flowers, create elaborate herbaria. This was scientific work, even if it wasn't recognized as such, and it gave women a legitimate reason to spend time outdoors, observing and studying nature. Now, let's talk about a truly revolutionary outdoor space, the tea garden. We mentioned these briefly when we talked about tea, but they deserve more attention because they represented something genuinely new in women's access to public space. Tea gardens opened in England in the early 18th century and became incredibly popular. These were commercial pleasure gardens where people paid admission to stroll along paths, listen to music, watch entertainments and yes, drink tea and eat light refreshments. Places like Vauxhall Gardens and Ranelagh Gardens in London attracted thousands of visitors on pleasant afternoons and evenings. And women could go there. Unescorted women even. Well, respectable women would usually go with companions, but the point is that tea gardens were public spaces that welcomed women in a way that coffee houses never did. For the first time, there were outdoor venues where women and men could mingle freely, where women could see and be seen, where they could participate in public leisure culture. Imagine what this meant. He began to study the art of painting. Women could walk in public gardens, listen to professional musicians perform, watch fireworks and other spectacles musicians perform, watch fireworks and other spectacles, meet friends, even meet potential romantic partners. Tea gardens were places where courtship could happen more freely, where young people could interact with less parental supervision than in a drawing room. And the gardens were beautiful paths wound through carefully landscaped grounds with flowers, trees, grottos, pavilions. There were illuminated walks for evening strolling. There were concert halls and dining areas. The whole experience was designed to be magical, enchanting, an escape from daily life. Mozart performed at tea gardens when he toured England as a child prodigy. So did Handel. These weren't lowbrow entertainment venues. They attracted all classes of society, from aristocrats to tradespeople, all mixing together on the paths and in the pavilions. But tea gardens also had a reputation for being places where improper things could happen. The dimly lit paths at night, the mixing of social classes, the relative freedom from supervision, all of this made tea gardens slightly scandalous. Moralists worried that young women would be corrupted there, that secret romances would bloom, that the gardens were basically encouraging immorality. And probably some of that did happen. Probably tea gardens were places where some social rules could be bent, where people could act a bit more freely than they could elsewhere. That was part of their appeal. They offered a taste of freedom, a break from the constant supervision and restriction of daily life. After 1783, some tea gardens even offered hot air balloon rides. Can you imagine floating above London in a balloon, seeing the city spread out below you, feeling the wind, experiencing that incredible sensation of flight? For women who rarely left their neighborhoods, who were told to stay grounded and proper and confined, a balloon ride must have felt like absolute freedom. But not all outdoor activities were as liberating. Some were heavily controlled and used to reinforce class distinctions and gender roles. Archery, for instance, became a popular activity for upper-class women in the 18th century. It was considered graceful and appropriate because it required precision and control rather than strength or aggression. Women would dress in elaborate archery costumes and gather for archery parties where they would shoot at targets, compete gently with each other, and socialize. It was exercise, yes, but it was also performance. You were supposed to look beautiful while doing it, to maintain your graceful posture, to not get too competitive or aggressive. Ice skating in winter was acceptable, again because it could be done gracefully. Swimming in summer was possible but complicated. Women couldn't swim in public pools or open water where they might be seen by men. They had to use segregated bathing areas, and they wore elaborate bathing costumes that covered them from neck to ankles. The costumes were so heavy when wet that they made actually swimming quite difficult. So most women's swimming was really just wading in shallow water. Boating was popular among the wealthy. Families would take boats on rivers and lakes for picnics and pleasure trips. Women could participate in this, could enjoy being on the water, though they weren't expected to do the actual rowing. That was men's work. Women were passengers enjoying the scenery and the fresh air, but not the physical exertion. Hunting was absolutely forbidden for respectable women. Riding horses for transportation or gentle pleasure riding was acceptable, but the idea of a woman joining a fox hunt, riding hard across fields, jumping fences, participating in the chase and the kill was scandalous. That was far too aggressive, too physical, too masculine. But some women did ride seriously, become skilled horsewomen, did push the boundaries of what was considered appropriate. They just had to be careful about it, had to frame it in acceptable terms, had to not be too open about enjoying the speed and the challenge. Cricket started gaining popularity in the mid-18th century. And here's something interesting. Cricket was actually considered acceptable for both men and women of all classes to play. It was one of the few sports where women's participation was relatively normalized. Women's cricket teams formed, and matches were played and watched by spectators. Now, women still faced restrictions. They couldn't play as aggressively as men. Their clothing limited their movement. They weren't taken as seriously as male players. But the fact that they could play at all, that there was a tradition of women's cricket, was significant. And all of these outdoor activities, whether walking or gardening or archery or cricket, gave women something beyond just exercise. They gave women reasons to be outside, to be in their bodies rather than just in their heads, to experience physical sensations and challenges. Because here's something we haven't talked much about yet. Women in the 18th century were expected to be very disconnected from their physical bodies. They weren't supposed to sweat or strain or get dirty. They wore tight corsets that restricted their breathing and movement. They wore layers and layers of clothing that weighed them down. They were told that too much physical activity would damage their health, particularly their reproductive health. There was genuine medical opinion at the time that women were too delicate for strenuous exercise, that their bodies couldn't handle it, that trying to be athletic would make them unable to bear children. This is absurd, of course. Women's bodies are perfectly capable of athletic activity. But these beliefs kept women sedentary, kept them physically weak, which in turn made them more dependent on men. So any outdoor activity, even something as simple as walking briskly in a garden, was a small rebellion against these restrictions. It was a way of claiming your physical body, of experiencing what it felt like to move and breathe and use your muscles. And some women really did find joy in physical activity. Jane Austen clearly loved her morning walks. She wrote about them with enthusiasm, talked about walking several miles in a morning, expressed genuine pleasure in the exercise. For her, those walks weren't just duty or health maintenance. They were something she genuinely enjoyed. There are also accounts of women who loved riding, who felt most free and most themselves when they were on horseback, moving fast across fields. Women who loved swimming, who found the sensation of being in water liberating. Women who enjoyed archery or bowling or other sports, who liked the challenge of physical skill, but they had to hide their enthusiasm, or at least moderate it. A woman who seemed too physical, too athletic, too interested in outdoor pursuits might be seen as unfeminine, odd, possibly even dangerous. She might have trouble finding a husband. She might be socially ostracized. So women learned to be strategic. They could walk but not too briskly. They could ride but not too well. They could enjoy outdoor activities, but not too enthusiastically. Always this balancing act, always this need to stay within acceptable bounds while still claiming some small measure of physical freedom. And for working-class women, outdoor activities had a completely different meaning. They didn't have the luxury of gentle walks for pleasure. If they were outside, they were working. Tending gardens that produced food, not ornamental flowers. Walking to market or to work, not for exercise. Any physical activity was labor, not leisure. The dairy was considered women's work in many households, and this often meant outdoor work, or at least work in outbuildings. Women would milk cows, make butter and cheese, care for poultry. This was physical labor, often exhausting. But because it was framed as domestic work as an extension of household management, it was considered appropriately feminine. So even here, in the realm of outdoor work, class made all the difference. Upper-class women might supervise dairy operations, might check the accounts and taste the final products, but they didn't do the actual labor. Working-class women did the physical work but didn't have the leisure to enjoy outdoor activities for their own sake. What strikes me about all of this is how much energy went into controlling women's relationship with the outdoors, with their own physical bodies, with movement and exercise. Society put enormous effort into defining acceptable and unacceptable outdoor activities, into policing how women moved through space, into ensuring that even when women were outside, they were still confined by rules and expectations. And yet women found ways to claim small. They took their brisk walks. They designed gardens that gave them pleasure. They went to tea gardens and experienced something approaching public leisure. They learned archery or cricket or riding, pushing boundaries where they could. Every afternoon spent in a garden. Every walk taken despite rain or cold, every boat trip enjoyed, every archery competition entered. These were small assertions of women's right to exist in physical space, to move their bodies, to experience the world beyond drawing room walls. And these small freedoms mattered. They gave women a taste of what it might be like to have real freedom of movement. They showed that women's bodies were capable of more than society allowed. They created possibilities for imagining a different kind of life. But we need to acknowledge that for many women, even these limited outdoor freedoms came with a cost. The cost of loneliness, of isolation, of spending hours alone or with only servants for company while husbands and brothers went out into the world, the cost of boredom, of spending afternoons in the same garden, walking the same paths, the cost of unspoken depression, of feeling trapped even when technically you are outside in the fresh air. And this darker side of women's afternoon hours, this emotional and psychological toll of confinement and restriction, this is what we need to explore next. Because behind all the accomplishments and activities, behind the music and letters and needlework and walks, there was often a deep well of unhappiness that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Let's be honest about that pain. As we continue our journey, I need to tell you about a feeling that women in the 18th century knew intimately but rarely named. The Duchess of Bedford, writing in the 1830s about a tradition that had started decades earlier, called it a sinking feeling that came between lunch and dinner. A sinking feeling. Those two simple words carry so much weight, don't they? Not sadness, not depression, not despair, just a sinking feeling. As if something inside you was slowly dropping, pulling you down into a darkness you couldn't quite name or escape. And here's what's heartbreaking. This feeling was so common among wealthy women that the Duchess invented afternoon tea partly to combat it. She needed something to look forward to, something to break up those long, empty hours between meals. A sinking feeling had become so normal, so expected, that the solution was refreshments, not addressing why women felt that way in the first place. So let's talk about what we haven't talked about yet. Behind all the accomplishments we've explored, the tea parties and needlework and music and letters, there was often profound unhappiness. There was loneliness so deep it felt like drowning. There was boredom so crushing it made hours feel like years. There was depression that had no name and no treatment, just an endless grey fog that some women walked through every single day. Nobody wanted to acknowledge it, because if you admitted that the life you were supposed to be grateful for was actually making you miserable, what did that say about you? If you had everything a woman was supposed to want, a home, a husband, children, security, comfort, and you still felt that sinking feeling every afternoon, clearly something was wrong with you, not with the system, with you. Let me read you something from Elizabeth Drinker's diary. She lived in Philadelphia and kept a remarkably detailed diary from 1758 until 1807, almost 50 years of daily entries. And scattered throughout those entries are moments of stark honesty about her emotional state. She writes about feeling low-spirited and melancholy. She describes days when she can barely motivate herself to do her needlework, when even that simple task feels overwhelming. But here's what's interesting. She almost always follows these admissions with self-criticism. She'll write that she feels sad, then immediately write that she has no reason to feel sad, that she should be grateful for her blessings, that she's being foolish or weak. She's internalized the message that her feelings are invalid, that she has no right to be unhappy. Can you imagine living like that? Feeling genuinely depressed but believing you have no right to those feelings. Having to hide your unhappiness not just from others but from yourself. Because admitting it would mean admitting you're ungrateful, unfeminine, somehow flawed. And the isolation made everything worse. If you were an upper-class woman living in a large house, you might go days without seeing anyone except your servants and immediate family. Yes, you could make social calls, but those were performances. You couldn't show up at someone's afternoon tea and start talking about how desperately lonely and unhappy you were. That would be completely inappropriate. So you smiled, you made polite conversation, you demonstrated your accomplishments, and you went home to your beautiful, lonely house. And the servants saw you, of course, but there was a wall between you and them. You couldn't confide in servants that would cross social boundaries that couldn't be crossed. So you were surrounded by people but completely alone. This is one reason why letter writing was so important to women. In letters, at least to close friends, you could be a little more honest. You could hint at unhappiness, could share struggles, could admit to feeling less than perfectly content. But even in letters, there were limits. You never knew who might read them. And for many women, there wasn't even the outlet of letter writing. If you weren't educated enough to write well, if you didn't have friends who could write back, if your husband or father disapproved of your correspondence, you might have no one to talk to at all about your inner life. Now, let's talk about something that made all of this worse, the prevalence of arranged marriages and loveless relationships. Many marriages in the 18th century, particularly among the upper classes, were business arrangements. Families negotiated them like contracts, which in fact they were. A woman's marriage settled property, created alliances, determined her entire future, and she often had little to no say in the matter. Oh, technically she could refuse a match. But the pressure to accept, the consequences of refusing, the limited options if she said no to one offer after another, all of this meant that many women married men they didn't love, didn't even particularly like. Now imagine spending your afternoons in a house with a man who is basically a stranger, or worse, someone you actively dislike. Imagine knowing that you will spend the rest of your life with this person, in this house, following this routine. Imagine knowing there is no escape, no possibility of change. Divorce was nearly impossible and socially ruinous. Separation was slightly more possible but still scandalous and left a woman in legal and financial limbo, so you were trapped. And those long afternoon hours when you sat in the drawing room doing needlework while your husband was out at his club or his office, those hours must have felt endless. The future stretching ahead of you, year after year of the same rooms, the same routine, the same loveless marriage. Some women found ways to cope. They threw themselves into their children, finding meaning and purpose in motherhood. They developed passionate friendships with other women, emotional relationships that sustained them, even if society didn't recognize them as legitimate. They lost themselves in books or music or religion, finding in these pursuits some escape from their daily reality. But some women didn't cope. They sank into what we would now recognize as clinical depression, and the medical treatments of the time often made things worse, not better. Let me tell you about laudanum. This was a tincture of opium in alcohol, and it was prescribed for everything: headaches, menstrual cramps, sleeplessness, nervousness, melancholy. Doctors handed it out freely and women took it, often not realizing how addictive it was. At first, laudanum seemed helpful. It dulled the pain, physical and emotional. It made the hours pass more easily. It created a pleasant fog that made loneliness and boredom more bearable. But gradually, you needed more and more to get the same effect. And if you tried to stop taking it, you experienced terrible withdrawal symptoms. So many women in the 18th and 19th centuries were addicted to laudanum without anyone calling it addiction. They were just taking their medicine following doctor's orders. But they were trapped in a different kind of prison, dependent on a drug that was slowly destroying them. And there were other women's tonics and remedies, many of which contained alcohol or other drugs. Women who would never dream of drinking spirits openly would consume these tonics throughout the day, medicating their unhappiness without acknowledging what they were really doing. The medical profession of the time had some truly disturbing ideas about women's mental health. There was a diagnosis called hysteria that was applied to women who exhibited a wide range of symptoms, from anxiety to depression to physical complaints. The word itself comes from the Greek word for uterus, because doctors literally believed these problems originated in the womb. Women diagnosed with hysteria might be prescribed bed rest, which meant weeks or months lying in bed, forbidden to read or write or do anything stimulating. This was supposed to be restful, but actually it was a form of sensory deprivation that often made mental health problems worse, not better. Or they might be told to have more children, on the theory that their wombs needed to fulfill their natural purpose. Or they might be subjected to various physical treatments that ranged from merely useless to actively harmful. The underlying assumption was always the same. If a woman was unhappy or anxious or depressed, something was wrong with her female body, not with her circumstances. The possibility that she might be unhappy because her life was genuinely difficult, because she had no freedom or autonomy or purpose beyond bearing children, this was rarely considered. Now, I want to talk about something even more troubling. There are cases in the historical record of women who showed signs of what we might now recognize as serious mental illness, mania, psychosis, dissociation from reality. And these women were often treated with incredible cruelty. If a woman's behavior became too erratic, too difficult to manage, she might be confined to an asylum. And asylums in the 18th century were horrific places. They were basically prisons where people were chained, neglected, subjected to treatments that were more like torture than medicine. Or she might be confined in her own home, locked in an attic room or basement, hidden. Away from society, the mad woman in the attic wasn't just a literary trope in Jane Eyre. It was a reality for some women whose families wanted to hide their mental illness rather than seek help. And here's the terrible irony. Sometimes the very isolation and restriction that caused or worsened women's mental health problems was then used to justify further restriction. A woman becomes depressed because of her limited, lonely life. Her depression is seen as evidence that she's not capable of handling more freedom or responsibility. So she's restricted further, which makes her more depressed, which leads to more restriction. A vicious cycle with no escape. But I want to be very clear about something. Not all women in the 18th century were depressed or unhappy. Many women found genuine joy in their lives, in their families, in their friendships, in their activities. Some women thrived within the constraints of their society. Some women were lucky enough to have loving marriages, fulfilling pursuits. The problem is that society provided no legitimate way to be unhappy. If you were one of the women who struggled, who felt that sinking feeling every afternoon, who couldn't find meaning or purpose in the narrow range of activities available to you, you had to suffer in silence. You had to pretend to be content. You had to hide your pain. And this expectation of constant contentment, this pressure to always be grateful and cheerful and satisfied, this itself was a form of cruelty, because everyone feels sad sometimes. Everyone has periods of loneliness or boredom or meaninglessness. That's part of being human. But women weren't allowed to acknowledge these normal human experiences. They had to maintain the illusion of perfect domestic happiness at all times. There's a letter from Lady Mary Wortley Montagu that captures this pressure perfectly. She writes to a friend about the expectations placed on women, and she says that women are taught from childhood to hide their real feelings, to always appear pleasant and agreeable regardless of what they're actually experiencing. She describes it as wearing a mask, a performance that becomes so habitual you almost forget you're doing it. But the cost of that constant performance was high. The cost was women who felt isolated even in crowded rooms. Women who felt they couldn't be fully honest with anyone, not even themselves. Women who internalized the message that their real feelings were shameful, wrong, evidence of personal failure. And let me tell you about one specific case that shows how dangerous this suppression of women's real experiences could be. We talked earlier about Mary Lamb, sister of the essayist Charles Lamb. Mary worked as a seamstress doing piecework for poverty wages. The pressure of the work, combined with caring for her aging, difficult parents, drove her to a mental breakdown. In September 1796, during an argument with her family while she was having a psychotic episode, Mary stabbed her mother to death. She also injured her father. It was a complete break with reality, a moment of madness brought on by unbearable stress. Mary was confined to an asylum, but eventually Charles was able to get her released into his care. She lived with him for the rest of his life, and when she was well, she was apparently a brilliant, charming woman who contributed significantly to their joint literary work. But she had periodic relapses, moments when the mental illness would return, and Charles would take her back to the asylum until she recovered. What strikes me about Mary Lamb's story is that she was driven to madness and violence partly by the impossible demands placed on her. She was supposed to work full-time doing exhausting sewing, care for her parents, manage the household, and do it all cheerfully and competently. When she couldn't maintain that impossible standard, when the pressure literally drove her insane, she was blamed. Institutionalized, nobody looked at the system that had placed such demands on her. Nobody questioned whether it was reasonable to expect one woman to work that hard for that little money while also providing unpaid care for her family. The problem was Mary, not the circumstances that broke her. And this pattern repeats throughout history. Women show signs of mental distress. The distress is treated as a personal failing, a weakness in the woman, rather than a reasonable response to unreasonable circumstances. And the solution is to try to fix the woman, to make her more compliant, more accepting, more able to endure what she shouldn't have to endure in the first place. I think about the women sitting in their drawing rooms on those long afternoons, feeling that sinking feeling. And I wonder how many of them understood that their unhappiness was reasonable. How many of them looked at the narrow bounds of their lives and thought, this is not enough, I need more than this. But then immediately suppressed that thought because having it meant there was something wrong with them. What would it have meant for those women to be told that their feelings were valid, that loneliness in isolation is normal, that boredom with repetitive tasks is normal, that feeling trapped when you have no freedom is normal, that the problem wasn't them. It was a society that gave them so little space to be fully human. But that validation almost never came. Instead, they got that dismissive phrase, a sinking feeling, as if what they were experiencing was a minor inconvenience rather than genuine psychological suffering. As if the solution was tea and cake rather than freedom and purpose. And the women who did try to speak honestly about their unhappiness were often pathologized. If you complained too much about your circumstances, you were difficult, ungrateful, possibly mentally ill. If you showed too much emotion, you were hysterical. If you withdrew into yourself, you were melancholic. There was no way to express legitimate unhappiness without being labeled as somehow defective. So most women stayed silent. They smiled through their sinking feelings. They filled their afternoons with activities that kept their hands busy, even if their hearts were empty. They medicated themselves with laudanum or alcohol or religion or romance novels, anything to make the hours pass more bearably. And the tragedy is that this pattern hasn't entirely disappeared. Even now, women's depression and anxiety are sometimes dismissed as personal failings rather than reasonable responses to systemic problems. Even now, women are expected to be endlessly resilient, to cope with impossible demands, to stay cheerful no matter what. But here's what gives me hope. The women of the 18th century who suffered through those lonely afternoons, who felt that sinking feeling, who struggled with depression and anxiety and isolation, they survived. Many of them found ways to create meaning and joy despite their constraints, and some of them, the ones who wrote letters and diaries that were preserved, left us a record of their struggles that helps us understand that we're not alone in our own difficult feelings. Their honesty, even the limited honesty they could manage, gives us permission to be honest too, to acknowledge when we're struggling, to admit that having all the things we're supposed to want doesn't always make us happy, to recognize that our feelings are valid even when they're inconvenient or uncomfortable. And their survival, their ability to find moments of joy and connection and purpose, even in very difficult circumstances, reminds us that humans are remarkably resilient, that we can endure more than we think we can. That even in the darkest afternoons, there can be moments of light. But we also owe it to them and to ourselves not to romanticize their suffering, not to pretend that those quiet afternoons were always peaceful and pleasant. They were often lonely and difficult and soul-crushing. And acknowledging that truth is important, because only when we see the reality can we work to change it. Now, as we near the end of our journey through these 18th century afternoons, we need to talk about what all of this meant, what it led to. How those hours of creativity and suffering and survival eventually contributed to real change. Because those women sitting in their drawing rooms, feeling isolated and restricted, they were part of a story that's still unfolding. Their struggles and their small rebellions helped create the world we live in now. So let's explore that legacy. Let's see how those quiet afternoons echo down through the centuries to reach us today. Let me tell you about a room that most people never saw. A space so intimate and personal that even close family members might not enter it without invitation. The boudoir. The word itself comes from the French verb bouder, which means to sulk or pout. A boudoir was literally a sulking room, a place where a woman could retreat when she was upset, where she could be alone with her feelings without having to perform happiness for anyone. But the boudoir became much more than just a sulking room. It became the only space in an entire household that truly belonged to a woman. Not the drawing room, where she entertained guests. Not the dining room or the parlor or any of the public spaces. Those belonged to the household, to the family. But the boudoir? That was hers. And what she did in that private space during those afternoon hours, when she could close the door and be truly alone, reveals more about women's inner lives than almost anything else we've explored. Because in the boudoir, away from watching eyes, women could be themselves. They could let down their guard. They could engage in activities that would be inappropriate in public. They could simply exist without performing femininity for an audience. Let's start with the most basic function of It was a dressing room. This was where a woman's clothes were kept, where she changed her dresses, where she went through the elaborate daily ritual of getting dressed and undressed. And in the 18th century, this ritual could take hours. Remember, wealthy women in the 1700s wore multiple layers of clothing. First, the chemise, a linen undergarment worn next to the skin. Then the stays, which we would call a corset, laced tightly to create the fashionable silhouette. Then petticoats, sometimes several of them. Then the gown itself, which might be in two pieces, a bodice and skirt. And all of this required help to put on and take off. So the boudoir was where a woman spent time with her lady's maid, being dressed and undressed, having her hair arranged, going through the physical transformations that turned her from a natural body into a fashionable lady. And this process, this daily ritual of construction, was deeply intimate. Think about it. Your maid saw you naked or nearly. Naked multiple times every day, she knew every detail of your body with your most personal needs. In some ways, your maid knew you more intimately than your husband did. And yet there was a wall between you, a class difference that meant you could never truly be friends or equals. This created a strange dynamic. In the boudoir, you were vulnerable, exposed, dependent on your maid's help. But you were also her employer, the person who controlled her livelihood. So the boudoir was simultaneously a space of intimacy and a space where power relations were constantly being negotiated. Now let's talk about an afternoon ritual that took place in the boudoir, the toilette. This word, which we now use to mean a toilet, originally meant the whole process of washing, grooming, and dressing. And for wealthy women, the afternoon toilette could be an elaborate, time-consuming affair. There's a fascinating practice that existed in the 18th century, particularly in France, but also in England among the very wealthy. Aristocratic women would receive visitors during their toilette. Yes, you heard that right. They would invite people to come watch them get ready, to sit in the boudoir and chat while the lady was having her hair powdered, or her face painted, or her dress adjusted. This might seem scandalous to us, receiving guests while you're getting dressed, but it was actually a sign of great intimacy and favor to be invited to someone's toilette. It meant you were part of their inner circle, and the lady herself would often be wearing an elaborate dressing gown or robe. So she wasn't exactly naked, but still, it was a much more informal, intimate setting than a formal drawing room visit. Queen Charlotte, wife of King George III, held morning receptions where ladies of the court would attend her while she was being dressed. This was an honor, a sign of royal favor. And it was also an opportunity for informal conversation, for sharing news and gossip, for the kind of personal interaction that couldn't happen in more formal settings. But for most women, the boudoir was a truly private space. And what they did there in those private hours varied enormously depending on their interests and inclinations. Some women used their boudoirs as personal libraries. They would have a bookshelf there stocked with their favorite books, the ones they read and reread. In the privacy of their boudoir, they could read whatever they wanted without worrying about whether it was appropriate or approved. They could lose themselves in novels, in poetry, in philosophy, in whatever spoke to their minds and hearts. Other women used their boudoirs as writing rooms. Mrs. Delany, a remarkable woman who lived from 1687 to 1788, turned her boudoir, which she called her closet, into a space for creative work. She's famous for creating incredibly detailed botanical collages, cutting tiny pieces of colored paper and arranging them to create images of flowers that are botanically accurate down to the smallest detail. She made almost 1,000 of these paper mosaics, starting when she was in her 70s, and she worked on them in her closet, her private creative space. This wasn't just a hobby for her. It was serious artistic and scientific work, but she did it in private, in her own room where she could focus without interruption. The boudoir was also where women kept their most personal possessions, their jewelry boxes, their private papers, their diaries if they kept them. These were locked away in the boudoir, safe from prying eyes, because privacy in the 18th century was precious and rare, and women guarded it fiercely in the few spaces where they could claim it. Now let's talk about the furniture of the boudoir, because it tells us a lot about how the space was used. There would typically be a dressing table with a mirror, essential for the daily toilette. There might be a writing desk, small and elegant, where a woman could write letters or keep accounts. There would be comfortable seating, perhaps a chaise longue, where a woman could recline and read. And here's something interesting. There were specialized pieces of furniture designed specifically for women's activities. Folding tea tables that could be brought out for intimate tea parties and then put away. Embroidery frames on stands, so a woman could work with both hands on her needlework. Small cabinets with many tiny drawers for storing threads, needles, beads, all the supplies for fancy work. These pieces of furniture were often beautifully made, decorated with inlays and paintings. They weren't just functional. They were status symbols, showing that the household had money to spend on specialized, elegant furniture for the ladies' use. But here's the reality behind all this elegance. Even in her own boudoir, a woman wasn't truly private. Servants came and went constantly. A lady's maid might be in the room for hours. Housemaids came too. Clean, to build fires, to bring water for washing. The illusion of privacy was just that, an illusion. And this is something we need to understand about 18th century upper-class life. True privacy, true solitude was almost impossible.
You were always surrounded by servants.
They were in the background of every moment of your life. They saw everything, heard everything, knew everything about you. For the servants themselves, this was also a loss of privacy. They had even less personal space than their employers. They often slept in tiny rooms, sometimes sharing beds with other servants. They had almost no time that was truly their own. Their lives were structured around their employers' needs. So when we talk about the boudoir as a private space, we need to remember that private meant something different in the 18th century than it does now. It meant a space that was relatively more private than other spaces. A space where outsiders weren't normally invited, but it was never truly private in the way we understand that word today. Now, let me tell you about one of the most famous boudoirs in history, Marie Antoinette's Petit Trianon. This wasn't technically a boudoir, it was an entire small palace, but it functioned in much the same way. It was Marie Antoinette's escape from the suffocating formality of Versailles, her private retreat where she could be herself. At the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette created a world that reflected her own tastes, rather than the rigid requirements of court life. She had gardens designed in the English natural style, rather than the formal French style. She had a fake rustic village built, complete with a working farm, where she could play at being a shepherdess, dressing in simple clothes and pretending to live a simple life. This might seem ridiculous to us now, and it certainly seemed ridiculous to many people at the time. The Queen of France playing at being a peasant, but I think it reveals something important. Marie Antoinette was so trapped by the formality and publicity of her position that she had to create an elaborate fantasy world just to experience a tiny bit of informality and privacy. At Versailles, her every move was watched, judged, governed by rigid etiquette. Even getting dressed in the morning was a public ceremony with strict rules about who could hand her what piece of clothing in what order. The Petit Trianon was her escape from all that. The only place where she could breathe, where she could choose her own activities, where she could be something other than a symbol. Of course, she was still surrounded by servants and attendants. Even at the Petit Trianon, she still had ladies-in-waiting, still had maids and gardeners and all the staff needed to maintain the place. But the rules were relaxed. The atmosphere was informal. She could choose who was invited and who wasn't. It was as close to privacy as a queen could get, and this brings us to a crucial point.
The more power and status a woman
had, the more her life was public, the more desperately she might crave private space. Marie Antoinette's Petit Trianon, Madame de Pompadour's private apartments, Queen Charlotte's closet. These were all attempts by powerful women to carve out some small space that belonged to them alone. For less powerful women, for middle-class women who had smaller houses and fewer servants, privacy might be easier to achieve in some ways. Your boudoir might be a small room where you truly could be alone sometimes, but you also had less help, which meant more demands on your time. You might have privacy but no leisure to enjoy it. And for poor women, the concept of a private room, a space that belonged to you alone, was a luxury beyond imagining. You shared beds with siblings or other family members. You lived in 1 or 2 rooms with your entire family. Privacy was almost non-existent. So once again, we see how class shaped every aspect of women's lives, including their access to private space. Boudoir was a privilege that only some women could claim. But for those who had boudoirs, they used them in ways that reveal so much about their inner lives. Some women kept diaries there, writing honestly about their thoughts and feelings in a way they couldn't do anywhere else. Some women practiced music in their boudoirs, working on difficult passages without an audience. Some women prayed there, used the space for religious devotion and contemplation. And some women simply sat there in their own rooms and breathed. Took a moment to not be performing for anyone, to let their faces relax from the pleasant expression they had to maintain in public, to stop being the perfect wife, the accomplished lady, the gracious hostess, and just be themselves for a little while. This matters more than you might think, because we all need spaces where we can be ourselves, where we don't have to perform, where we can let down our guards. For 18th century women who had to perform femininity and propriety constantly in public spaces, the boudoir was often the only place where that performance could stop. And what they chose to do in those private moments tells us what really mattered to them. The woman who read forbidden books in her boudoir valued intellectual freedom. The woman who wrote poetry in her closet valued creative expression. The woman who simply sat and stared out the window might have been giving herself the gift of quiet contemplation, of thinking her own thoughts without interruption. The boudoir was also where women prepared for the evening portion of the day. Remember, the afternoon ended when they changed their dresses for dinner. That change of clothing happening in the boudoir marked the transition from the relative freedom of afternoon hours to the formal socializing of evening. A woman might spend an hour or more in her boudoir, preparing for the evening. Her maid would help her out of her afternoon dress and into something more elaborate for dinner. And whatever social activities followed, her hair would be redressed, perhaps more elaborately. Jewelry would be added. Face paint might be applied or refreshed. This transformation happened in the boudoir, in that private space. And then she would emerge, perfectly groomed and dressed, ready to perform her role for the evening. The boudoir was the backstage area where the actress prepared before going on stage. Do you see the pattern here? Throughout everything we've explored, women's lives were about performance. They performed accomplishment at the harpsichord. They performed refinement at tea parties. They performed femininity in their dress and their manners and their activities. And the boudoir was one of the only places where that performance could pause. But even there, even in their most private space, they weren't entirely free, because they had internalized the performance so thoroughly that it shaped even their private moments. The books they chose to read, the activities they engaged in, the thoughts they allowed themselves to think, all of these were shaped by what they had been taught was appropriate for women. True freedom would have meant the ability to be whoever you wanted to be, to pursue whatever interested you, regardless of whether it was considered feminine or appropriate. And that kind of freedom was rare in the 18th century, even in the privacy of the boudoir. But still, the boudoir mattered. It was a crack in the system, a small space where women could exercise some control, could make some choices, could be a little bit more themselves. And those small spaces of autonomy added up across thousands of women in hundreds of years, helped create the possibility of larger freedom. Because women who had their own rooms, their own private spaces where they could think and create and be themselves, those women could imagine having more. They could imagine a world where they had not just one private room but genuine freedom, where their entire lives weren't performances but authentic expressions of who they really were. And that imagination, that ability to envision something different, that's where change begins. In the quiet of a boudoir, a woman sitting at her writing desk, thinking her own thoughts, might begin to imagine a different life. And that imagination, shared through letters and conversations, spread from woman to woman until it became a movement. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can talk about the legacy and the change that came, we need to look at one more aspect of those afternoon hours. One more contradiction that women had to navigate. We need to talk about reading, about books, about the dangerous pleasure of losing yourself in stories and ideas. Because reading was both encouraged and feared, both essential to being an accomplished lady and potentially corrupting to feminine virtue. And the books women read in those quiet afternoons, the stories they lost themselves in, the ideas they encountered, these shaped them in ways that society both wanted and feared. So let's turn the page together and explore the world of books. There's a warning that appeared in countless magazines and advice books throughout the 18th century. It went something like this: beware the young woman who reads too much, especially novels. Such reading will inflame her imagination, fill her head with impossible romantic notions, make her dissatisfied with her real life, and quite possibly ruin her for marriage. Reading, these authorities insisted, was dangerous for women. It could corrupt their virtue, disturb their minds, and lead them astray from their proper domestic duties. And yet, at the same time, being well-read was considered an essential accomplishment for any lady of quality. You were supposed to be able to discuss literature intelligently. You were expected to have read the classics, to know poetry, to be conversant with contemporary publications. Not reading enough was a sign of ignorance and low breeding. So women had to navigate yet another impossible contradiction: read, but not too much. Be educated, but not too educated. Engage with books, but not the wrong books. And definitely don't enjoy it too much or get too absorbed in the stories you're reading, because that might indicate you had an overactive imagination, which was considered almost as dangerous as actual immorality. Let me tell you about a phenomenon that had moralists terrified in the late 18th century: reading fever. This was the name they gave to what happened when young women became obsessed with novels, reading them compulsively, staying up all night to finish them, neglecting their duties and their health in favor of one more chapter. One concerned father wrote that his daughter had contracted a violent passion for novels, and now spent all her time reading them, ignoring her needlework, her music practice, even her meals. She would hide books in her room and read by candlelight late into the night. She lived, he complained, more in the fictional worlds of her novels than in the real world where she belonged.
Here's the thing that strikes me about this.
They weren't wrong that reading could be transformative and even dangerous. But the danger wasn't to women's virtue or their mental health. The danger was to the system that kept them confined. Because books opened windows to other worlds, other possibilities, other ways of living. Books showed women that their narrow domestic existence wasn't the only option, wasn't even the only respectable option. When you read about heroines who were brave, intelligent, capable, who had adventures and made choices and shaped their own destinies, it became harder to accept a life where you weren't allowed to do any of those things. When you read philosophy and history and science, you realized you were capable of understanding complex ideas, which made it harder to accept being treated as intellectually inferior. So yes, reading was dangerous. It was dangerous to the status quo. It gave women ideas, and women with ideas were much harder to control then. Women who simply accepted what they were told. Now, let's talk about what women were actually reading during those quiet afternoon hours. The answer is everything they could get their hands on. Despite all the warnings and restrictions, women in the 18th century were voracious readers. For wealthy women who had their own private libraries or access to their father's or husband's libraries, the options were extensive. They could read classical literature in translation, works by ancient Greek and Roman authors. They could read contemporary poetry, essays, philosophy. They could read travel narratives, natural history, religious texts, political treatises. And yes, they could read novels. The 18th century saw an explosion in novel writing and novel reading, and women were both the primary readers and increasingly the primary writers of novels. This created a whole new literary tradition, one that was distinctly associated with women. Samuel Richardson's Pamela, published in 1740, was a phenomenon. It's an epistolary novel told through letters written by a servant girl who resists. Her employer's attempts to seduce her and eventually marries him after he reforms. The novel was wildly popular, particularly among women readers. People read it, discussed it, argued about it. Was Pamela virtuous or manipulative? Was her employer genuinely reformed or just clever? These debates raged in drawing rooms across England. Richardson followed Pamela with Clarissa, an even longer novel about a young woman who is tricked and assaulted and ultimately dies, but dies virtuously, maintaining her moral integrity even in death. It's a devastating, powerful book, and it was hugely influential. Women read it and wept over it and wrote letters to Richardson begging him to change the ending, to let Clarissa live and be happy. Do you see what's happening here? Women weren't just passively consuming these stories. They were engaging with them, emotionally and intellectually, discussing them. With friends, forming opinions about them, even trying to influence the author. Reading was creating communities of discussion and debate. And then there were the Gothic novels, stories of mystery and terror set in crumbling castles and ancient monasteries. Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, published in 1794, was the most famous. It featured a heroine who faces kidnapping, imprisonment, mysterious apparitions, and all manner of dangers, but who ultimately prevails through her own courage and virtue. These Gothic novels were enormously popular with women readers, and they were also criticized for being too exciting, too frightening, too likely to overstimulate feminine nerves. Critics worried that women who read these books would become hysterical, would have nightmares, would lose their grip on reality. Jane Austen, who was a sharp observer of her society, gently mocked this reading fever in her novel Northanger Abbey. The heroine, Catherine Morland, is a devoted reader of gothic novels who starts imagining that real life is just like the novels she reads. She suspects murder and dark secrets where there are none. But Austen's satire is actually quite kind. Catherine is naive but not stupid. She learns from her mistakes, and Austen defends novel reading as a legitimate and valuable activity. There's a famous passage in Northanger Abbey where Austen argues that novels, despite being dismissed by critics, actually contain more genius, wit, and taste than many more respected forms of writing. She's defending her own profession as a novelist, but she's also defending all the women who love to read novels. She's saying their pleasure is legitimate, their taste is valid, and novels themselves are worthy of respect. But not all reading was fiction. Many women read serious non-fiction during their afternoon hours. History was considered an appropriate subject for women. It was educational without being too scientific or masculine. Women read about ancient Rome and Greece, about English history, about the history of other European nations. Travel narratives were also popular. Women who couldn't travel themselves, who were confined to their homes and neighborhoods, could read about distant lands, exotic cultures, adventures in foreign places. These books opened up the world to women who would never see most of it with their own eyes. Religious texts were always acceptable reading for women. The Bible, of course, but also sermons, devotional works, books of prayers and meditations. Some women found genuine spiritual nourishment in these texts. Others might have used them as a cover for reading something else, hiding a forbidden novel inside a respectable religious volume. And some women read science. We mentioned botany earlier as an acceptable science for women. But some women ventured into astronomy, chemistry, natural philosophy. They read about the latest discoveries, the newest theories. They tried to understand how the world worked there. Or even some science books written specifically for women. These tended to be simplified, presented in dialogue form or as letters, supposedly to make them more accessible to female minds. But even these simplified texts gave women access to scientific knowledge that they wouldn't otherwise have had. Now, let's talk about where women got their books, because not everyone had a private library full of volumes. There were circulating libraries, commercial establishments where you could pay a subscription fee and borrow books. These became increasingly popular in the late 18th century and made books much more accessible to middle-class women who couldn't afford to buy every book they wanted to read. But circulating libraries were also considered potentially dangerous. They stocked novels, lots of novels, because that's what people wanted to read. And the clerks at these libraries might recommend sensational books to young women, books that their parents wouldn't approve of. So some. Families forbade their daughters from using circulating libraries without supervision. Women also borrowed books from each other. We've talked about how they discussed books in letters. They also literally shared books, passing volumes around their social circles. If one woman bought a new novel, she might lend it to 5 or 6 friends. This created networks of shared reading, communities of women who were all reading the same books and could discuss them together. And some women wrote in their books, made notes in the margins, marked passages they found particularly meaningful. These annotations give us windows into how they were reading, what they were thinking about, what moved them or troubled them or excited them. When you can see a woman's handwriting in the margin of an 18th century book, arguing with the author or noting a connection to something else she'd read, you feel this direct connection across the centuries. She was a reader just like you, engaging with ideas, having. But reading, like everything else in women's lives, came with restrictions and judgments. You were supposed to read at appropriate times, in appropriate places, in appropriate ways. Reading during the afternoon hours, in the privacy of your room or in the drawing room when there was nothing else pressing to do, this was acceptable. Reading when you should be attending to other duties, reading late into the night. Reading so much that it affected your health or your social obligations, this was excessive and wrong. And you were supposed to read with proper discrimination. You were supposed to be able to tell good books from bad ones, moral books from immoral ones. But of course the standards for what counted as good or bad, moral or immoral, were set by male authorities who often had a vested interest in keeping women from reading anything that might give them ideas about their own capabilities. There's a particularly revealing anecdote about Hannah More, one of the Blue Stocking Women. She wrote a novel called Celebs in Search of a Wife, published in 1809, about a man looking for the perfect wife. The book was incredibly popular and went through many editions. But even as Hannah More was celebrating her success as an author, she was also writing advice books telling other women to be careful about reading too many novels. So even a woman who made her living by writing books that women wanted to read felt the need to warn against reading too much. This shows how deeply internalized these contradictions were. Women absorbed the message that they were simultaneously supposed to be cultured and educated but not too intellectual, supposed to read but not the wrong things or in the wrong ways. Let me share something that I find both sad and inspiring. There are cases of women who taught themselves to read as adults, who came from backgrounds where girls weren't educated, but who desperately wanted to access the world of books. These women would struggle. Through basic literacy texts, would practice writing letters, would slowly, painstakingly build the skills they needed to read the books they wanted to read. And what did they read, these self-taught readers? Often they read the Bible first because that was a respectable reason to want to read. But then they expanded to other texts, to novels and poetry, to whatever they could get their hands on. The effort they put into learning to read shows how much books mattered, how much access to ideas and stories meant to women who had been denied it. Think about spending years learning to read, struggling with each word, and then finally being able to pick up a novel and lose yourself in it. Think about how precious that would be, how magical for women who fought that hard for literacy. Reading wasn't just a pleasant pastime. It was a hard-won victory, proof of their own capability and determination. And for some women, reading led to writing. If you spent your afternoons reading novels, might start to think, I could write a novel, I could tell stories too. And some women did exactly that. They started writing, first maybe just in their diaries or in letters, but then more ambitiously, creating stories and poems that they might share with friends or even try to publish. Publishing was difficult for women. If you published under your own name, you risked being mocked or criticized. People might question your morals, might assume you were unfeminine or aggressive. Many women published anonymously, their books identified only as by a lady or with some other vague attribution. But they published anyway. They wrote, and they found ways to get their words into print, because reading had shown them that their thoughts and stories mattered, that there was an audience for women's voices, that they had something to say that was worth saying. And here's what gives me chills. When we read 18th century novels today, when we pick up Pamela or Evelina or the mysteries of Udolpho, we're reading books that were often written by women sitting in their boudoirs or at desks in their drawing rooms during those afternoon hours we've been exploring. They were writing in the small spaces of freedom that their society allowed them. And those words they wrote in those quiet afternoon hours have survived for centuries, are still being read and studied and discussed today. Those women have outlived almost everyone who tried to control or limit them. Their voices, preserved in their books, speak to us across the centuries. And that's a kind of immortality that no amount of needlework or tea parties or musical accomplishment could ever achieve. Reading gave women ideas. It gave them vocabulary to describe their experiences. It gave them examples of different ways to live, even if those ways were fictional. It connected them to other minds, other times, other possibilities. It made them harder to control, harder to confine, harder to convince that their narrow lives were all they deserved. And that's why reading was considered dangerous. Not because it would corrupt women's morals, but because it would expand their minds. Not because it would make them hysterical, but because it would make them think. Not because it would ruin them for marriage, but because it might make them question whether the marriages available to them were worth having. Those quiet afternoons spent reading weren't wasted time. They were revolutionary time. Every woman who picked up a book and lost herself in it, who learned something new, who encountered an idea that challenged what she'd been taught, who found in reading a pleasure and a purpose that nothing else in her life gave her, that woman was part of a quiet revolution that would eventually change the world. But we've spent so much time inside, in drawing rooms and boudoirs and libraries. And all of this, everything we've explored, exists within a particular context, a particular system of restrictions. So now, as we approach the end of our journey, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. We need to understand what all of these quiet afternoon activities, all of these small rebellions and adaptations and survival strategies, what they added up to. We need to see how the seeds planted in those afternoon hours eventually grew into movements that changed history. So let's take that final step together and discover the legacy of those seemingly quiet afternoons. Here's a question that haunted the 18th century art world. Can women be true artists? Not crafters, not hobbyists, not ladies with pleasant accomplishments, but genuine artists creating work worthy of serious consideration. The official answer from critics and most male artists was usually number. Women, they claimed, lacked the intellectual capacity for great art. They could copy, they could do pretty watercolors, but they couldn't create original, powerful work that deserved to hang in galleries alongside men's paintings. And yet, when you actually look at the art women were creating during those quiet afternoon hours, When you see the paintings and drawings and intricate works they produced, that official answer starts to crumble. Because women were creating extraordinary art, they just weren't always being recognized for it, weren't always being allowed to sign their names to it, weren't always being permitted to claim the title of artist. Let me tell you about a woman who refused to accept those limitations. Sofonisba Anguissola, born in 1532 in Italy, slightly before our main period but important to understanding what came after. She was a Renaissance painter who became famous across Europe for her portraits. She painted nobility. She painted herself. She created works that were technically brilliant and psychologically insightful. And she did something remarkable. She painted self-portraits, multiple self-portraits, paintings where she showed herself as an artist holding a palette and brushes, clearly identifying herself as a creator, not just a subject. In one famous self-portrait, she shows herself painting a picture of the Virgin Mary. She's claiming her identity as both artist and woman, showing that the two aren't contradictory. Sofonisba's success opened doors for other women artists, but those doors never opened fully, never stayed open reliably. Every generation of women artists had to fight the same battles, prove the same capabilities, overcome the same prejudices. By the 18th century, painting and drawing were considered appropriate accomplishments for ladies, but only certain kinds of painting and drawing. Watercolors were acceptable. They were seen as delicate, feminine, suitable for ladies. You could paint flowers, landscapes, pretty scenes. You could make copies of famous paintings for practice. You could do portraits of family members. But oil painting, that was more problematic. Oil paints were messy, smelled strong, required extensive training and practice. Working in oils was serious art, and serious art was for men. Women who wanted to work in oils had to overcome significant resistance. And painting the human figure, especially the nude human figure, that was absolutely forbidden for respectable women. How could a lady study anatomy? How could she spend hours looking at naked bodies? The very idea was scandalous. And yet, understanding human anatomy was considered essential to being a great artist. So women were excluded from one of the fundamental training grounds of artistic excellence. But some women found ways around these restrictions. Lavinia Fontana, another Italian artist from the 16th century, became famous for painting mythological scenes that included nude or semi-nude figures. She found patrons who would support her work, and she painted what she wanted to paint, restrictions be damned. And there were women in the 18th century who followed in these footsteps, who pushed boundaries where they could. Angelica Kaufmann, born in 1741 in Switzerland, became one of the most successful artists of her generation. She painted historical scenes, mythological scenes, portraits. She was one of only 2 women among the founding members of the Royal Academy of Arts in London in 1768. Think about that. The Royal Academy, one of the most prestigious art institutions in Europe, and only 2 of the founding members were women. That tells you everything about how difficult it was for women to be recognized as serious artists, even when they were clearly talented enough to deserve recognition. But let's talk about what most women were actually doing during their afternoon hours when they engaged with visual art. For most women, artistic pursuits meant watercolor painting. And there's nothing wrong with watercolors. They are a legitimate and a challenging medium. But they were assigned to women partly because they were seen as less serious, less important than oils. Women would paint flowers carefully, studying the petals and leaves and stems, creating botanically accurate images that were also beautiful. Some of these flower paintings are extraordinary, showing incredible skill and observation. But they were dismissed as mere decoration, pretty pictures rather than serious art. Women painted landscapes too, scenes from nature or architectural views. If a family took a trip, the daughters might bring their sketchbooks and paint watercolors of the places they visited. These were like photographs before photography existed, visual records of travels and experiences. And some women specialized in miniature painting, creating tiny portraits on ivory or vellum. These miniatures were often worn as jewelry or kept in lockets, intimate personal objects rather than public art. Miniature painting required incredible precision and skill. You were working on a surface that might be only a few inches across, trying to capture a person's likeness and personality in that tiny space. There's that portrait we mentioned earlier, painted by François Dumont around 1788 of a woman at a harpsichord. It's a miniature only about 3 inches in diameter, painted in watercolor on ivory. But look at the detail. The way the artist has captured the folds of the woman's dress, the expression on her face, the keys of the harpsichord. That's serious artistic skill, even though it's small and done in watercolors. Now, let's talk about shell work, because this is one of the most fascinating artistic pursuits that women engaged in during the 18th century. Women from royalty to gentry collected seashells and used them to decorate all sorts of objects. They created shell pictures, arranging tiny shells to form images of flowers or scenes. They covered boxes and frames and furniture with intricate shell designs. This was considered an appropriate feminine craft, something decorative and pretty. But when you actually look at the shell work that survives from this period, you realize it was women were working with natural materials, understanding their colors and textures and shapes, creating complex three-dimensional compositions. This was sculpture, essentially. But because it was done by women with shells, it was dismissed as mere craft. Queen Charlotte, King George III's wife, was known for her shell work. She created elaborate shell decorations and encouraged other women at court to do the same. Having royal approval made shell work even more fashionable among upper-class women. And then there was another artistic medium that women excelled at, needlework pictures. We talked about needlework as labor and accomplishment, but some needlework transcended craft and became genuine art. Women created pictures entirely in thread, using different stitches and colors to create shading, depth, texture. Some of these needlework pictures are based on paintings or engravings, but the translation from paint to thread required real artistic skill. You had to understand color, composition, how to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface. And you had to have the technical embroidery skills to execute your vision. The Metropolitan Museum in New York has a collection of 18th-century American needlework pictures that are absolutely stunning. There are pastoral scenes with incredible detail, every sheep individually rendered, trees with tiny stitched leaves, skies with gradations of color creating the effect of clouds and sunset. These aren't just craft projects, they're works of art. But here's the cruel irony. Because these were made by women, because they were made with needle and thread rather than paint and brush, they were relegated to the category of decorative arts rather than fine arts. They weren't exhibited in galleries, they weren't reviewed by critics, they weren't taken seriously as art, even when they demonstrated all the same skills and aesthetic qualities that made paintings valuable. Distinction between craft and art, between decorative and fine, was fundamentally gendered. Things men made were art. Things women made were craft. Never mind that the actual skill level might be identical, or that the women's work might even be more technically demanding. The medium and the gender of the maker determined how the work was valued, and this had real consequences. Male artists could support themselves by selling their work, could build professional careers, could achieve fame and recognition. Women artists, even talented ones, struggled to be taken seriously, struggled to find patrons who would pay them what their work was worth, struggled to gain entrance to the institutions and networks that could advance a career. Some women found patrons in other women. Wealthy women would commission portraits from women artists, would buy their paintings and miniatures, would recommend them to friends. This created a kind of parallel art market, women supporting women. Opportunities that the official art world didn't provide, but it was limited. The same exhibition opportunities, the same critical recognition that male artists received, even the most talented women artists faced barriers that were almost insurmountable. And yet they created, during those afternoon hours in their boudoirs and studios and drawing rooms. Women painted and drew and created. Some did it purely for their own pleasure, with no thought of recognition or professional success. Some did it hoping to be noticed, hoping their work might be exhibited or sold, hoping to make a mark in a world that didn't want to see them as artists. Rosalba Carriera, born in Venice in 1675, became internationally famous for her pastel portraits. She painted royalty and nobility across Europe. She was elected to academies in multiple countries. She was recognized in her own lifetime as a great artist. But she was an exception. For every Rosalba Carriera, there were dozens of talented women whose names we've forgotten, whose work is unsigned or attributed to men, whose artistic contributions have been erased from history. Think about all the paintings from the 18th century attributed to unknown artists. How many of those were actually painted by women whose names weren't considered worth recording? How much great art have we lost because women weren't allowed to sign their work, weren't allowed to claim credit for their creations? And think about all the women who had genuine artistic talent but never got the training or the opportunity to fully develop it. Women who could have been great painters but instead spent their afternoons doing watercolors of flowers because that was all society would permit. That's not just a loss for those individual women. It's a loss for all of us, for the entire culture that could have benefited from their fully realized artistic visions. But here's what gives me hope. The art that women did create, the watercolors and miniatures and needlework pictures and shell work, a lot of it has survived. And now, finally, in the 21st century, scholars and curators are taking it seriously. They're studying women's artistic production, recognizing the skill and creativity it represents. trying to recover the names and stories of women artists who were forgotten. Museums are mounting exhibitions of women's art from the 18th century. Art historians are writing books and articles analyzing this work, placing it in its proper context, arguing for its importance. The work that was dismissed as mere craft or hobby is being recognized as the art it always was. And we're learning that those quiet afternoons when women sat with their paintbrushes or their needles, creating images and objects of beauty, those weren't wasted hours. Those were hours of genuine artistic creation, of women using whatever tools and materials they were allowed to express themselves, to create beauty, to leave a mark on world. Every watercolor of a flower, every needlework picture, every shell-covered box, every miniature portrait. These are evidence that women were creators, were artists, had something to say and found ways to say it despite all the restrictions placed on them. And some of what they created has lasted for centuries, has survived in museums and private collections, still beautiful, still speaking to us about the women who made them and the world they lived in. That's a kind of triumph, a quiet victory over all the voices that said women couldn't be real artists, that their work didn't matter, that they should confine themselves to accomplishments that didn't challenge male dominance in any field. But we've come so far on this journey, explored so many aspects of those 18th century afternoons. We've seen the creativity and the suffering, the accomplishments and the restrictions, the small freedoms and the overwhelming constraints. We've met women who thrived and women who struggled, women who found purpose and women who despaired. We've watched them drink tea and embroider and write letters and play music and read books and paint pictures, filling their hours as best they could within the narrow space society allowed them. And now, finally, we need to ask the big question. What did it all mean? What came of all those quiet afternoon hours? How did those small acts of creativity and resistance and survival add up to something larger? We need to talk about legacy, about change, about the long arc of history that connects those 18th century drawing rooms to our lives today. So stay with me for this final part of our journey as we discover what those seemingly quiet afternoons ultimately helped create. Draw a line in your mind. It starts in 1746 in a drawing room where Elizabeth Montagu sits writing letters to her friends, discussing Plutarch and philosophy, building the network that will become the Blue Stocking Society. Follow that line forward through the decades. It passes through afternoon tea parties where women share books and ideas. It winds through boudoirs where women read forbidden novels. It moves through salons where intellectual conversation happens on equal terms. And where does that line end up? In 1848 at Seneca Falls, New York, where women gather for the first women's rights convention in American history and demand the right to vote. That's not a metaphor, that's actual history. The women who organized Seneca Falls, women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, they were the intellectual descendants of those 18th century women who created spaces for female thought and discussion in their drawing rooms. The skills learned over tea, the confidence built in salons, the ideas developed through letters and reading, all of that contributed to the movements that would eventually change the world. But let's trace this connection more carefully, because it's important, and it's often overlooked. How exactly did afternoon tea parties lead to women's suffrage? How did needlework and letter writing contribute to revolution? It started with education. The Blue Stockings and other intellectual women of the 18th century made a crucial argument. Women were capable of serious learning, of engaging with complex ideas, of contributing to intellectual discourse. This wasn't obvious to everyone at the time. Many people genuinely believed women's minds were inferior, incapable of abstract thought or rigorous study. By demonstrating through their conversations, their letters, their published works, that women could think as well as men, these 18th century women laid the groundwork for arguing that women deserved education. And if women deserved education, then they needed schools. They needed teachers. They needed access to books and learning. By the early 19th century, schools for girls were opening throughout Europe and America. These weren't the same schools that taught basic literacy. These were real educational institutions teaching history, literature, mathematics, languages. The quality varied enormously, and they still taught things like needlework and music that boys' schools didn't, but they represented real progress. And educated women wanted more than just to be educated. They wanted to use their education. They wanted professions, careers, public roles. The idea that a woman might be a teacher, a writer, a scientist, even a doctor, these ideas seemed radical in the early 1800s. But they came directly from the 18th century recognition that women had minds worth developing. Mary Wollstonecraft, writing in 1792 in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, made the revolutionary argument that women deserve the same education and the same rights as men. She argued that the supposed intellectual inferiority of women was the result of inferior education, not of natural incapacity. Give women the same opportunities as men, she claimed, and they would show themselves to be equally capable. Where did Wollstonecraft get these ideas? Partly from her own brilliance and observation, certainly, but also from being part of intellectual circles where women's thoughts were taken seriously. She knew women who read philosophy and science. She corresponded with women who engaged with complex ideas. She had evidence from her own experience and observation that women's minds are not naturally inferior, and her book, controversial as it was, became a foundational text for feminism. It was read and discussed and argued about. It influenced women who came after her, who took her ideas and pushed them further, who demanded not just education but political rights, economic opportunities, legal equality. Now, let's talk about the skills women developed in those afternoon hours. Organizing tea parties and salons taught them how to bring people together, how to facilitate conversation, how to build communities. These are organizational skills, and they became crucial when women started organizing. For political change, the temperance movement, which fought against alcohol abuse in the 19th century, was heavily driven by women. They organized meetings, gave speeches, circulated petitions. Where did they learn these skills? Partly from organizing social gatherings, from the experience of being hostesses and community builders. The abolitionist movement, which fought to end slavery, also had significant female participation. Women organized anti-slavery societies, circulated petitions, raised money, wrote pamphlets. They used the networks they'd built through social connections, the letter-writing skills they had developed through correspondence, the rhetorical skills they'd practiced in salon conversations. And when the women's suffrage movement emerged in the mid-19th century, it drew on all of these experiences. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, all the leaders of the suffrage movement were skilled organizers, powerful speakers, strategic thinkers. They knew how to build coalitions, how to sustain movements over decades, how to keep fighting despite setbacks and opposition. They learned these skills partly from experience, from trial and error. But they also inherited traditions of female organization and resistance that went back through the abolitionist and temperance movements, back through the educational reform movements, back to those 18th century salons and letter-writing networks. Here's Virginia Woolf, writing in 1929, in a room of one's own, making an argument about what women need to create. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. A room of her own. The boudoir, that private space we talked about earlier, Woolf is saying it's essential. It's necessary for creativity and independent thought. And she's right. The women who had private spaces in the 18th century, rooms where they could think and read and write without constant supervision, those were the women who often accomplished the most. Elizabeth Montagu had her drawing room where she hosted the Blue Stockings. Mrs. Delany had her closet where she created her botanical art. Jane Austen had a table in a common room where she wrote her novels, hiding her pages when people came in. But at least she had that table, that space to work. Woolf is drawing a direct line from those 18th century spaces to the needs of 20th century women writers. The struggle for private space, for time and room to think and create, that struggle hasn't ended. It just continues in different forms. And what about the needlework, that activity that critics like Wollstonecraft dismissed as wasted time? Well, here's an interesting development. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, needlework became political. Women created elaborate embroidered banners for the suffrage movement. Beautiful works of art that proclaimed their demands for the vote. They took a skill they had been taught was purely domestic and decorative and weaponized it for. The arts and crafts movement of the late 19th century also rehabilitated needlework, arguing that handcraft was valuable, that things made by hand had worth beyond their utility. Women who had been dismissed as mere crafters started to be recognized as artists. It took a long time and the recognition is still incomplete, but the shift began. And now in the 21st century we're seeing another revival. Fiber arts, embroidery, quilting, these are being reclaimed by a new generation of artists and crafters who see them as valid forms of creative expression. There are contemporary artists creating political commentary through embroidery, making feminist statements with needle and thread, continuing a tradition that goes back centuries. Those 18th century women who spent their afternoons stitching, they were part of a long tradition of female creativity that has survived all attempts to dismiss or devalue it. Their work matters. It always mattered. And finally we're starting to recognize that. Let me tell you something that moves me deeply. I was recently at a museum exhibition of 18th century women's letters and needlework. And there was a young woman there, maybe 20 years old, standing in front of a sampler made by a 13-year-old girl in 1775. The sampler had a verse stitched on it about virtue and death and obedience. And this young woman was crying. I asked her if she was okay, and she said, "I just keep thinking about how young she was and how she had to stitch that message about being obedient and accepting death. And I wonder if she believed it or if she resented it. And I wish I could tell her that we remember her, that her work survived, that she mattered." That's the power of these connections across time. That sampler was made during a quiet afternoon in 1775. And in 2024, it's still speaking to us, still making us think and feel, still connecting us to the girl who made it. Her hands held that needle, moved it through the
Fabric created something that would outlast her by centuries. That's not nothing.
That's immortality of a sort.
And all those afternoon activities we've explored, the tea parties and the letter writing and the music and the reading and the painting, all of it contributed to a gradual shift in how women were seen and how women saw themselves. It was slow, painfully slow. It took generations, but it happened. Women went from being legally property to being legally persons, from having no right to education to having universities open to them, from being forbidden to vote to winning suffrage, first in New Zealand in 1893, then gradually in other countries through the 20th century, from being barred from most professions to being able to pursue any career, from having almost no control over their own lives to having, at least legally in many countries, equal rights. We're not done. The struggle for equality continues. Women still face barriers and discrimination. The pay gap persists. Violence against women remains a crisis. In many parts of the world, women still have few rights. The work is not finished.
But we've come so far from those 18th century drawing rooms where women's afternoons
were supposed to be filled with accomplishments designed to make them marriageable. We've come so far from a world where a woman's only value was in her virtue and her ability to manage a household. And that progress, slow and incomplete as it is, started in part in those quiet afternoon hours. Started with women who read books and had ideas. Started with women who wrote letters and built networks. Started with women who created salons and proved they could think. Started with women who did what they could within their constraints and slowly, gradually expanded those constraints until they finally broke free. Do you see why this matters? Do you see why we spent so many hours tonight exploring these seemingly trivial afternoon activities? Because they weren't trivial. The seeds of revolution. They were women claiming whatever space they could, developing whatever networks were possible, and then using all of that to demand more. Every woman who reads this, who has the freedom to pursue education or a career, who can vote and own property and make her own decisions, you are living in a world those 18th century women helped create. Not directly, not alone, but they were part of the long chain of resistance and resilience that eventually led to change. And the struggle continues. We inherit both their achievements and their unfinished work. The question is, what will we do with those quiet hours that we have, those spaces of freedom they fought for? How will we use the rights they helped win? What will we create? What networks will we build? What changes will we demand? Because history doesn't stop. The story isn't finished. Those 18th century women were part of a long story of human liberation that continues.
In our time, their afternoon hours contributed to our freedom.
What will our hours contribute to the freedom of women who come after us? I hope you'll think about that. I hope you'll remember when you sit down with a cup of tea or pick up a book or write a letter or create something with your hands that you're part of a long tradition. Women have been doing these things for centuries, finding meaning and purpose and creativity in whatever spaces they were allowed, and slowly expanding those spaces until they broke through walls that seemed unbreakable. Those quiet afternoons in 18th century Europe weren't really quiet at all. They were full of thinking and feeling and creating and resisting and surviving and slowly, gradually changing the world. And that work continues in our afternoons, in our quiet hours, in the spaces we create for ourselves. We continue that work. We remember those women. We honor them by using the freedoms they helped win. We continue their fight by pushing for the equality that still eludes us. We are their legacy, and we owe them not just gratitude but action. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. Thank you for spending these hours exploring the hidden world of 18th century women's afternoons. I hope you've learned something, felt something, been moved to think differently about history and about the quiet moments in your own life. If this story spoke to you, if you found value in these explorations, please let me know in the comments. Share your thoughts about what surprised you, what moved you, what you'll remember. And if you know other people who would appreciate this kind of deep dive into hidden history, please share this with them. I'll be back soon with another story, another journey into the past to discover truths that speak to our present. Because history isn't just about what happened long ago. It's about understanding how we got here and imagining where we might go next. Sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, a part of a story that began centuries ago and continues through you into the future. Good night, sweet dreams.